Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. I was making my second perimeter round a little after 2 in the morning when I noticed the light beyond the north fence. At first, I thought it was a vehicle on Old Mill Road. The airport where I worked was small enough that calling it an airport probably gave the wrong impression. It was outside Walla Walla, Washington, and most nights there wasn't much happening after the last commercial flight came in. A few private hangars stayed active late, and sometimes cargo crews showed up at odd hours, but between midnight and 5 it was mostly me, a maintenance guy named Curtis Hale if something broke, and whoever was working the fire station. My name was Daniel Mercer. I was 38 then, and I'd been doing overnight security there for almost 3 years. The north side of the property backed up against open farmland. There was a perimeter road inside the fence, then a ditch, then fields. Old Mill Road ran maybe half a mile farther out, depending on which part of the fence you were standing near. That night was cold and clear. Not freezing, but close. There hadn't been rain for a couple of days, and the sky was clear enough that I could see stars between the runway lights. I was driving one of those white airport utility pickups with the yellow beacon on top. I had the window cracked because the heater made me sleepy. The light was off to my left. It looked white at first. I slowed down because I assumed somebody had pulled onto one of the dirt farm access roads and was facing the airport with their headlights on. Then I realized there was only one light. It wasn't especially bright. That was one of the strange things about it. It didn't light up the ground underneath it the way a floodlight would. There was just this round white point sitting above the dark line of the field. I stopped the truck. I couldn't tell how far away it was. That sounds stupid because there were fence posts and irrigation equipment out there, but the light didn't seem attached to anything. There wasn't enough around it to judge its size. I watched for maybe 30 seconds, expecting it to move. It didn't. I radioed dispatch. Our dispatcher that night was a woman named Marlene Ortiz. I said, "You seeing anything north of the field?" She asked what I meant. I told her I had a stationary light outside the perimeter near the wheat fields. She said, "Plane?" I said, "No." There was a pause. Then she said she'd check the traffic display. I kept watching. A commercial aircraft way off to the west was blinking red and white, and I could hear it faintly. The light I was looking at didn't blink. Marlene came back and said there wasn't any reported traffic in that direction below 10,000 feet. I remember saying, "It's lower than that." She asked how low. I didn't know what to tell her. Maybe 100 feet. Maybe 500. Maybe farther away than I thought, and much higher. I got out of the truck. That was when I noticed there wasn't any sound coming from the direction of the light. The countryside around the airport was quiet at that hour, but never completely silent. There were distant trucks on Highway 12, electrical equipment humming, wind moving through dry weeds along the fence. I could hear all of that. There wasn't an engine sound. I walked up to the fence. The light seemed to be hovering over a field owned by one of the bigger farms north of the airport. I knew there was no tower there. No grain elevator either. It was just open land. I called Marlene again and asked her to write down the time. She said, "Already did." I glanced at my watch, 2:17. Then the light changed. Not dramatically. It just went from white to something slightly yellowish, then back to white. I thought maybe that meant it was a helicopter turning. I kept waiting to see navigation lights. Nothing. About a minute later, I heard a clicking noise behind me. I turned around fast enough that I actually pulled my flashlight from my belt. There was nothing behind the truck. The sound came again. Click. Then another one. Click. It sounded like somebody tapping two metal objects together. I walked back toward the truck and checked underneath it because I thought maybe the engine was cooling oddly, even though it was still running. The clicking stopped. When I looked back toward the field, the light was still there. Marlene radioed and asked whether I wanted airport police. We technically had law enforcement assigned to the airport, but overnight it was usually city or county response unless somebody was already nearby. I told her no because I still didn't know what I was looking at. That became something I regretted later, mainly because I wished somebody else had stood there with me. I drove farther east along the perimeter road to see if the angle changed. It did, but not the way I expected. I moved maybe 400 yards down the fence, stopped again, and the light looked like it was in almost the exact same place relative to me. I stared at it for a while, trying to convince myself I was mistaken. There was an irrigation pivot out in the field that I used as a reference. From the first place I'd stopped, the light had been slightly left of it. From the second place, it was still slightly left of it. That didn't make sense unless it was much farther away, but if it was farther away, it had to be enormous. I got out again. This time, I noticed something else. The security light on a utility building near the fence had gone out. It was one of those pole-mounted orange lights that stayed on all night. I could see the pole clearly, but the lamp was dark. I called Marlene. She checked the electrical panel status and said nothing had tripped. While we were talking, the orange light came back on. She said, "Did it just come back?" I said yes. Then she said something that bothered me. She said my camera feed froze. There were fixed security cameras covering several sections of the perimeter. The north camera wasn't pointed directly toward the field, but part of the fence line should have been visible. Marlene said the image had stopped updating for about 20 seconds. I asked if it recorded. She said she'd check. The unidentified light was still sitting there. By then, I had been watching it for around 6 minutes. I remember my hands starting to get cold because I had left my gloves in the truck. Then I saw something move underneath the light. I wasn't sure about this part even while it was happening. There was a darker shape below it, not a person. It looked more like a vertical section of darkness moving sideways. I know that sounds ridiculous because the whole field was dark, but this was darker against the faint glow of the sky. It moved maybe 20 feet, stopped, then disappeared. I raised my flashlight even though there was no chance the beam would reach that far. The moment I switched it on, the white light went out, not faded, out. I stood there looking at the empty field. Marlene said, "Daniel?" I told her it was gone. About 5 seconds later, it reappeared much farther to the right. That was the first moment I felt actual fear. It hadn't crossed the distance between those 2 points. There was no visible movement. It had just been in one place, gone dark, then appeared somewhere else. I got back inside the truck and locked the doors. I don't normally lock the doors on the airfield. I sat there with the engine running and watched it through the windshield. The light was brighter now. Not blinding, but definitely brighter than before. Then it began moving. It went straight sideways, slowly, perfectly level. There was no bobbing or drifting that I could see. I watched it move across maybe a quarter mile of horizon, then stop. Marlene asked if I was still watching it. I said yes. She said she had called Curtis. Apparently, he was still in the maintenance building finishing paperwork. A couple of minutes later, Curtis came on the radio. He sounded annoyed. He asked where I was. I told him North Perimeter, marker N7. He said he was coming over. I looked at my watch again, 2:26. The light had been visible for about 9 minutes. Then I heard the clicking sound again. This time it came from the passenger side of the truck. 3 clicks. Slow. Click, click, click. I didn't look immediately. I don't know why. I just sat there staring straight ahead with both hands on the steering wheel. Then I turned my head. There was nobody outside. The passenger window reflected the interior of the cab and the yellow roof beacon flashing behind me. Beyond that was the fence. I saw movement near one of the fence posts, something low. I grabbed the spotlight mounted beside the driver's door and swung it around. There was nothing there. No animal. No person. Then Curtis came over the radio asking me to confirm my location again. While I was answering him, the light rose. It went upward so slowly at first that I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Then it kept speed. Still no sound. It climbed into the sky and became smaller. It didn't streak away. It just kept going up until it looked like a star. Then it disappeared. I waited another minute. Curtis pulled up behind me in a maintenance van. He got out wearing a sweatshirt and a reflective vest. He asked where it was. I pointed. There was obviously nothing to show him. He looked around and asked whether I had seen a drone. I said maybe. He asked how big. I told him I had no idea. That was basically the end of the incident. We drove the perimeter together and didn't find anything damaged. No cut fence, no vehicle tracks near the service gates. At 3:10, I went back to the security office and wrote the incident report. I kept it simple. Unidentified stationary light observed beyond north perimeter fence between approximately 02117 and 02277 hours. No corresponding aircraft traffic located. Light moved vertically and was no longer visible. Temporary interruption reported on north camera feed. I didn't write about the dark shape. I didn't write about the clicking. I didn't want the report to sound stupid. The camera recording wasn't useful. There was a 23-second gap where the timestamp jumped forward. Before and after that, the camera showed the fence and nothing else. I finished my shift at 6 and went home. I slept until about 1 in the afternoon. At 2:40, Marlene called me. She sounded different from normal. She said, "There are 2 guys here asking about your report." I thought she meant county investigators. I asked who they were. She said, "I don't know." Then she lowered her voice. "They're dressed like they're going to a funeral." I laughed because I thought she was exaggerating. She wasn't. I drove back to the airport because my supervisor, Randall Price, wanted me there. When I walked into the administration building, I saw the 2 men standing near the security office. Both wore dark suits. Not matching suits, but close. One was older, maybe mid-50s, with gray hair cut very short. The other looked younger, probably early 40s. Dark hair, thin face. Neither one wore sunglasses. That detail mattered to me later because whenever I told anybody about this, they assumed sunglasses. They didn't have them. The older man introduced himself as Edwin Vale. The younger one said his name was Marcus Venn. I remembered those names because they sounded strange together, but not strange enough to obviously be fake. Vale showed me a leather credential wallet. There was a photograph, his name, an identification number, and the words Federal Aviation Security Liaison Office. I had never heard of it. I had worked around TSA people, FAA inspectors, airport police, customs officers, and military personnel. I had never heard of the Federal Aviation Security Liaison Office. Venn showed a similar credential. Their badges looked real enough. Randall didn't challenge them. He brought us into the conference room. Vale asked me to explain what I'd seen. I basically repeated my written report. He asked how long the light had remained stationary. I said 6 or 7 minutes before it started changing position. Venn corrected me. He said 9 minutes, 40 seconds. I looked at him. I asked how he knew that. He said, "Based on your dispatch recordings." That was possible. I hadn't listened to them. Vale asked whether I saw any aircraft shape behind the light. I said no. He asked about colors. I said mostly white, briefly yellow. He asked whether it flashed in a repeating pattern. I said no. Then he asked whether I had left my vehicle. I said yes. His eyes moved to Venn. It was quick, but I noticed. Vale asked, "For how long?" I said maybe 2 minutes the first time, less the second. He asked whether I experienced static over the radio. I said no. He asked whether my flashlight worked normally. That question surprised me. I said yes. Venn was looking down at a copy of the incident report. Then he said, "You didn't mention sound." I asked what sound he meant. He looked up. Vale looked at him. For a second, nobody said anything. Then Venn said, "Aircraft noise, rotor noise, anything like that." I said no. Vale asked to see the original logbook. Randall brought it out. Vale put on thin gray gloves before touching it. That bothered me more than it probably should have. He read the entry, then asked if anybody else had physically observed the light. I told him Curtis arrived after it disappeared. He asked for Curtis's full name. Randall gave it to him. Then Vale asked Marlene to come into the room. They questioned her about the camera interruption. She explained the frozen feed and timestamp gap. Venn asked if any other cameras had malfunctioned. She said no. He asked whether the airport had experienced voltage fluctuations. She said no. Val asked whether the north perimeter had motion detectors. Randall said only gate sensors. Then there was another pause. Vale closed the logbook. He looked directly at me and asked, "Were any dogs outside when the light appeared?" I thought I'd misheard him. I said, "Dogs?" He said yes. Security dogs, police dogs, strays, anything of that nature. I told him we didn't use security dogs. There were sometimes coyotes outside the fence, but I hadn't seen any. He said, not coyotes. The way he said it was flat, specific. I said I hadn't seen any dogs. He asked if I had heard barking. I said no. Then asked, are you certain? I told him yes. He wrote something in a small black notebook. That was the only thing either of them wrote down during the whole meeting. Vale thanked us. Randall asked whether they needed copies of the camera footage. Vale said no. He said, we already have the relevant material. Randall asked how they had gotten it. Vale smiled slightly and said their office coordinated with federal aviation partners. It wasn't really an answer. They left around 3:25. I watched them walk out through the front windows. Their car was a dark blue Ford sedan with Oregon plates. They didn't park in the visitor spaces. They had left it along the curb. Ven got into the driver's seat. Vale stood beside the passenger door for maybe 15 seconds. He was looking toward the north side of the airport. Then he got in. They drove away. Randall went straight back to his office. Marlene looked at me and said, "What was that dog question?" I told her I had no idea. Curtis arrived for his afternoon shift about 20 minutes later. I told him about the two men. He listened without saying much. When I mentioned the question about dogs, his expression changed. He said, "That's weird." I asked why. He told me that around 2:30 the previous morning, while he was inside the maintenance building, he'd heard a dog whining outside the rear door. There weren't supposed to be dogs on the airfield. He hadn't gone out to check because he assumed it was some kind of animal near the fence. He said the whining lasted maybe 30 seconds. Then it stopped. I asked why he hadn't told me. He shrugged. He said, "You didn't ask." That evening, I tried searching for the Federal Aviation Security Liaison Office. I found nothing. I tried different versions of the name. Nothing. The next night, I checked the airport directory and our federal contact sheets. There was no such office listed. A week later, I asked Randall if he had gotten any follow-up. He said no. I asked if he'd verified their credentials. He got irritated and told me to leave it alone. After that, nothing happened for several weeks. I went back to normal shifts. The north camera never had another recording gap. I didn't see the light again. Then, near the end of November, I was driving home after work at about 6:20 in the morning. It was dark and lightly raining. I stopped at the intersection of Isaacs Avenue and Wilbur. A dark blue sedan was behind me. I only noticed because one of its headlights looked slightly dimmer than the other. The light changed. I turned right. The sedan turned right. I drove another mile and turned into a gas station. The sedan continued past. I told myself I was being paranoid. I bought coffee and sat in my car for a couple of minutes. When I pulled back onto the road, the same sedan was parked on a side street about 2 blocks down. Maybe it wasn't the same one. There are a lot of dark blue sedans. I drove past without slowing. I couldn't see the driver. I went home and slept. That afternoon, I found 3 dead porch light moths arranged in a straight line on the concrete outside my front door. I almost laughed when I saw them because it was such a small, meaningless thing. They were spaced a few inches apart, all facing the same direction. I swept them away. A few days later, I came home from work and my neighbor, Lauren Beck, was getting her mail. She asked if I worked for the government. I said no. She said 2 men had come by earlier asking if I lived there. I felt my stomach tighten. I asked what they looked like. She said one was older with gray hair. She hadn't spoken to the other one. I asked what they wanted. She said the older man told her they were trying to confirm an address connected to an airport security matter. They didn't knock on my door. According to Lauren, they stood in my driveway for a minute, looked at the house, then left. I called Randall. He told me nobody from the airport had given out my home address. I asked whether federal investigators could have gotten it anyway. He said obviously they could. Then he told me again to stop worrying about it. I didn't see the men after that. I worked at the airport until the following spring, when I took a daytime security job at a food distribution warehouse in Pasco. On my final night, I made one last perimeter drive around 4 in the morning. It was windy and cloudy. When I reached marker N7, I stopped. I don't know why. I sat there looking through the fence at the dark field. There was nothing unusual. After maybe 30 seconds, I started driving again. Then the radio made a single sharp click. I stopped the truck. Another click came through the speaker, then a third. There wasn't any voice. I called dispatch. A guy named Aaron was working that night. He answered immediately. I asked if he'd transmitted something. He said no. I asked if anyone else was on the channel. He said just us. I kept looking at the radio. Aaron asked if something was wrong. I told him no. I drove back toward the terminal. When I reached the security office, there was a plain white envelope sitting on the desk beside the sign-in book. My name was written on the front in block letters. Aaron said it had been there when he came back from the restroom. There was no stamp, no return address. I opened it. Inside was a photocopy of my original incident report from October. Nothing else. Someone had circled one sentence in black ink. Unidentified stationary light observed beyond north perimeter fence. At the bottom of the page, underneath the report, somebody had written 5 words. No domestic animals were present. I put the paper back in the envelope. Aaron asked what it was. I told him it was old paperwork. I finished the rest of the shift, clocked out at 6, and drove home. The envelope stayed in the glove compartment until I sold the car 2 years later. I saw the light when I was about 15 minutes from home, somewhere between Kinderhook and Valety. It was a little after 10 at night, and I was driving alone on one of those narrow county roads that cut through farmland in that part of upstate New York. I had stayed late at my sister's place helping her pack for a move, and I was tired enough that I had the radio off. There had been rain earlier. The road was still wet, and every so often a little fog hung over the low parts of the fields. My name was Aaron Calloway. I was 34 at the time, and I lived outside Valety in a small rental house with my dog. I had driven that road dozens of times. There was an abandoned farmhouse along it that everybody locally knew. It sat back maybe 100 yards from the road behind a line of old maple trees. The house itself had been empty for years. White siding gone gray, porch leaning slightly, barn partly collapsed behind it. There was a chain across the driveway with a faded no trespassing sign. I'd never thought much about the place. That night, as I came around the bend before the farmhouse, I saw something bright moving down through the clouds. At first, I thought it was a plane. Albany International wasn't that far away, and you saw aircraft all the time. But this wasn't moving across the sky. It was going downward, almost straight down. I slowed without really thinking about it. The light looked yellow-white, maybe like a very bright street lamp seen from a distance. There was no blinking red light around it. Nothing green, nothing that looked like normal aircraft lighting. It dropped behind the trees near the abandoned house. I expected some kind of flash. There wasn't one. I kept driving. For maybe 5 seconds, everything looked normal. Then a glow appeared behind the farmhouse. Not huge, not dramatic. It was just bright enough that I could see the outline of the roof and chimney from the road. I took my foot off the gas. There wasn't supposed to be power at that property. I knew that because a friend of my father's had once looked into buying the land, and he'd mentioned that the utility service had been disconnected years earlier. I rolled past the driveway at maybe 15 miles an hour. The glow seemed to be coming from somewhere behind the house, around the barn. Then my radio turned on. That was the first thing that really bothered me. I hadn't touched it. It came on loud enough to make me flinch. There wasn't music, it was just static. I reached over and shut it off. A few seconds later, it came back on. Same static. I pressed the power button again. Nothing happened. I pressed it twice more before the radio finally went quiet. By then, I had gone another couple 100 feet down the road. I should have kept going. Instead, I stopped. I don't have a good reason. Part of me thought there might have been a plane crash behind the farmhouse. Maybe a small aircraft. Maybe somebody needed help. I pulled onto the shoulder. I didn't get out. The glow behind the house was still there. I lowered my window a few inches. The road was wet and completely empty. I heard water dripping from the trees. Somewhere farther off, a tractor or some kind of diesel equipment was running. Then that sound stopped. Not faded. Stopped. For a few seconds, I couldn't hear anything except my own engine. I checked my phone. I had 1 bar of service. I thought about calling 911, but I didn't know what I would say. I hadn't actually seen anything crash. While I was sitting there, the light behind the house got brighter. It didn't spread across the field. It stayed concentrated behind the buildings, but the tops of the trees were suddenly visible. I remember noticing the branches because they weren't moving. There had been a little wind all evening. Now they looked completely still. Then something crossed between two of the trees. I only saw it for a second. It looked like a person. That's the simplest way I can describe it. A dark, upright shape moved from the direction of the house toward the barn. It seemed too far away for me to make out details, but it moved strangely slowly. Not limping, not running, just walking at a steady pace. I locked my doors. The shape disappeared behind the barn. I stared at that spot for probably 20 seconds. Nothing else moved. Then there was a knock from somewhere underneath my car. One solid metallic sound. I jumped and looked in the mirrors. Nothing. Another knock came from underneath the rear of the vehicle. I immediately put the car in drive. As I pulled away, my dashboard lights dimmed. The headlights stayed on, but everything inside the car went dark for maybe 2 seconds. Then it all came back. The clock on the dashboard read 10:48. I remember that because I looked directly at it. I drove faster after that. Not crazy fast, but probably 10 or 15 over the limit. I kept checking my rearview mirror. The road behind me was empty. After maybe 2 miles, I reached a stop sign at a larger road. A car was coming from the left. I waited. It passed in front of me. It was an older, dark-colored sedan. Maybe black, maybe navy. There were 2 people inside, both men. I only got a quick look because they were moving, but the passenger turned his head and looked directly at me as they went by. That made me uneasy, although there was nothing unusual about somebody looking at another car at an intersection. I turned right. The sedan continued in the opposite direction. A minute later, my phone rang. The screen showed unknown caller. I didn't answer. It rang until voicemail picked up. Then it immediately rang again. Unknown caller. I let it go. The third time I answered because I thought maybe it was my sister calling from somebody else's phone. I said hello. There was no response. I could hear a faint sound. At first I thought it was static. Then it sounded more like wind going over a microphone. I said hello again. A man's voice said, "Are you driving?" That was all. I hung up. My hands started shaking. I called my sister. She answered normally. I told her somebody weird had just called me and asked her to stay on the phone until I got home. She asked what had happened. I told her I'd explain later. I reached my house around 11. My dog Toby normally ran to the door when I came in. That night he stood in the hallway. He was staring past me at the front window. I shut and locked the door. He still wouldn't move. I checked outside. There was nobody in the driveway. I called my sister back and told her I was home. Then I looked at the clock on my microwave. It said 11:17. That didn't seem right. From the farmhouse to my house usually took about 15 minutes. Even if I'd driven slowly, I shouldn't have gotten home that late. I checked my phone. 11:17. I opened the call history. The unknown number had called me at 10:59. That made even less sense. I was certain the dashboard clock had read 10:48 when I left the farmhouse. I tried working backward. Maybe my car clock was wrong. Maybe I'd looked at it wrong. Maybe I'd been parked longer than I thought. I didn't know. I barely slept. The next morning, I woke around 7:30. It was gray outside with low clouds and light mist. I had to be at work by 9. Normally, I would have taken Route 9H, but I decided to drive past the farmhouse again. I wanted to see if there had been an accident. I told myself I'd probably find emergency vehicles or utility workers and feel stupid for getting so worked up. When I reached the property, there were no emergency vehicles. There was just a dark sedan parked beside the road. It looked very similar to the one I'd seen the night before. 2 men were standing near the chain across the farmhouse driveway. They wore dark suits. That immediately looked wrong because the shoulder was muddy and wet, and both of them were wearing polished black shoes. I slowed down. One of the men raised his hand, not waving, more like he wanted me to stop. For a second, I considered driving past. Then I thought they might be police or insurance investigators. I pulled over about 30 feet beyond them. Both men walked toward my car. The older one came to my window. He looked around 50. Thin gray hair, pale face, no facial hair. The younger man stood a few steps behind him. He had dark hair combed straight back and a face that looked oddly expressionless. The older man smiled. Morning, he said. His tone was friendly. I lowered my window about halfway. He asked, "Did you happen to stop here last night?" I felt my stomach drop. I said, "Why?" He glanced toward the farmhouse. "We're following up on some reported activity in the area." He didn't say what kind of activity. I asked if they were police. The younger man reached inside his coat and showed me an identification wallet. He opened and closed it quickly. I saw a photograph in some kind of silver envelope. I didn't catch the agency name. I asked him to show it again. He didn't. He didn't. The older man said, "We're not local law enforcement." I asked what agency they were with. He said something that sounded like Environmental Infrastructure Office. I had never heard of that. I said, "Environmental what?" He repeated it, same calm tone. Then he asked again whether I'd stopped the night before. I said yes. He nodded like he already knew. "Did you leave your vehicle?" I said no. "Did you see anybody on the property?" I hesitated. The younger man looked at me. His eyes were very light, gray or blue. I said I thought I had seen somebody near the barn. The older man asked, "One person?" I said yes. "Male or female?" I couldn't tell. "Did the person approach the road?" No. "Did you hear any voices?" I said no. He asked whether my car had malfunctioned. That caught me off guard. I said, "Why would you ask that?" He gave a small shrug. "People sometimes report electrical issues on rural roads." I told him my radio had acted strangely. The younger man finally spoke. "What did it receive?" I said static. He asked, "Only static?" I said yes. He looked at the older man. The older man asked if I had used my phone while stopped. I said no. Then he asked, "Did anyone call you before you resumed driving?" I said no. Technically, that was true. The calls came later. He stared at me for a moment. Then he smiled again. It wasn't threatening. That somehow made it worse. "How long would you say you were stopped here?" I thought about it. "Maybe 5 minutes. The younger man said, 8 minutes and 12 seconds. I looked at him. He didn't change his expression. I said, "What?" He repeated it. 8 minutes and 12 seconds. The older man turned slightly toward him like he hadn't expected him to say that. I asked, "How would you know that?" Neither answered immediately. There were no traffic cameras on that road. No businesses. No houses close enough to have security cameras pointed toward the shoulder. The older man finally said, "We have access to roadway information." I said, "What roadway information?" He ignored that. He asked exactly where I'd parked. I pointed behind us. "Right around there." The younger man looked toward the spot. Then he walked over to it. He stood on the shoulder looking down at the wet grass. I saw him bend slightly. There was something there, a black patch in the grass. I'd noticed it when I pulled up, but assumed it was mud. The older man followed my eyes. He said, "Did you step outside the vehicle at any time?" I said no again. "You're certain?" "Yes." He nodded. Then he asked a question that made absolutely no sense to me. "Was your interior light on?" I asked why that mattered. He said, "We're trying to establish visibility." I told him it came on when I unlocked the doors after I got home, but not while I was parked. He said, "Good. Just that. Good." The younger man came back. He quietly said something to the older man. I couldn't hear it. The older man thanked me for my time. I asked what had happened at the farmhouse. He said, "Nothing you need to be concerned about." I told him I had seen a bright light go down behind the property. He looked at me differently then. Not surprised. More like I had said something he preferred I hadn't. "What kind of light?" I described it. He asked how high it had been when I first saw it. I said I couldn't judge. "Did it descend behind the structure from your perspective?" "Yes." He nodded. The younger man asked, "Did it touch the ground?" I said I didn't know. He asked again, "Did you see it touch the ground?" "No." He seemed satisfied. The older man stepped back from my car. "That's useful," he said. I asked for their names. The older man said his name was Raymond Sutter. The younger one said, "Cole." I asked if Cole was his first name or last name. He just said, "Cole." I told them I wanted a card. Sutter reached into his coat. For a second I thought he was going to give me one. Instead, he checked his pocket and said he'd run out. He didn't seem embarrassed about it. I drove away. I watched them in my mirror. Neither man returned to the sedan. They stood together on the shoulder watching my car until I went around the bend. At work, I searched for the agency name. Nothing came up that matched. I tried several variations. Still nothing. Around lunchtime, I called the Columbia County Sheriff's Office. I explained that two men claiming to be some kind of officials were near the abandoned farmhouse asking drivers questions. The dispatcher sounded confused. She said she didn't know of any investigation there. I gave her the location. She said she'd pass it along. About 20 minutes later, somebody from the sheriff's office called me back. He said a deputy had driven past. The sedan was gone. Uh, the men were gone. There was no sign anybody had entered the property. He asked me to describe them. I did. Then he asked about the car. I realized I hadn't looked at the plate. That bothered me because I usually noticed plates. My father had worked in auto insurance, and I had always been one of those people who noticed vehicle details without trying. All I could remember was that the sedan had a New York plate. I couldn't remember a single number or letter. That evening, I got home around 6. Toby met me at the door like normal. I made dinner and tried to stop thinking about the whole thing. Around 8, somebody knocked. I froze. Toby barked. I looked through the front window. It was my neighbor, Gail. She lived 2 houses down. I opened the door. She asked if I was expecting somebody from a government office. I said no. She told me a man had come to her door around 4 asking whether she'd seen my car arrive home the night before. I asked what he looked like. Gray hair, dark suit, polite. She said he'd asked what time I got home. Gail had told him she didn't know. Then he'd asked if Toby had been outside. That detail scared me more than anything else so far. I asked exactly what he'd said. She thought for a moment. Then she repeated it. He asked, was the dog outdoors when she returned? I hadn't told either man I had a dog. My sister knew. My landlord knew. People in the neighborhood knew. But those men hadn't been to my house while I was there. I thanked Gail and locked the door. For the next few days, I took different routes to work. Nothing happened. I didn't see the sedan. Nobody called. About 2 weeks later, curiosity got the better of me, and I drove by the farmhouse again in daylight. The black patch I'd seen on the shoulder was gone. The grass had been cut. That was strange because the rest of the roadside hadn't been mowed. Only that section. Maybe 20 feet. I didn't stop. By December, snow covered the fields, and I stopped thinking about it every day. In January, the abandoned farmhouse was torn down. I saw the demolition crew from the road one morning. The barn came down too. A month after that, I ran into a guy named Peter Novak at a grocery store. His family owned property near there. I asked if he knew why the old farmhouse had suddenly been demolished. He said the county had declared it unsafe. I said I thought it was privately owned. He said it was. Then he added something strange. He said somebody had bought the entire parcel in cash shortly after Thanksgiving. I asked who. He didn't know. That spring, they planted corn on the land. Nothing was built there. No new house, no warehouse, just corn. I moved out of that rental the following year and ended up in Massachusetts for work. I kept the same phone number. Almost 3 years after that night, I received another unknown caller call. It was around 7 in the evening. I normally ignored those, but I was waiting on a call from a contractor, so I answered. I said hello. There was silence for several seconds. Then I heard the same faint rushing sound I'd heard on the road. A man said, "Aaron?" I said, "Who's this?" He didn't answer. I asked again. Then he said, 8 minutes and 12 seconds. I hung up. The number didn't call again. I changed my number a few weeks later. I drove back through Valety the next summer to visit my sister. I took the old road on purpose during the afternoon. The farmhouse property looked completely ordinary. Cornfields, trees, the same ditch along the road. There wasn't any sign that a house had ever been there, except for a break in the tree line where the driveway used to be. I slowed down as I passed. There was a dark sedan parked farther up the road. Nobody stood outside it. I kept driving. When I reached the next intersection, the sedan pulled onto the road behind me. It followed me for about 4 miles. Then I turned toward town. It continued straight. I made it to my sister's house a few minutes later. I parked in her driveway, went inside, and stayed there until after dinner. When I finally came back outside, there was nothing strange on the street. My car started normally. My phone worked. I drove home before dark. I never used that county road again. I noticed the shape in the third strip of negatives because it covered part of a telephone pole. At first I thought it was dust. I owned a small camera shop in Eugene, Oregon, back when people still brought in a lot of 35mm film. This happened in October of 1998. The shop was called Northside Camera and Photo, and it sat in a little strip of businesses off River Road between a laundromat and a place that repaired vacuum cleaners. My name was Martin Keller. I was 41 then. Most of my business came from passport photos, film processing, used lenses, and people who wanted prints made from old negatives. I did 1 hour processing during the day, but I usually stayed after closing to clean the machines and finish anything that had piled up. That afternoon had been wet and cold. Not heavy rain, just the steady Oregon kind that made everything outside look gray. Around 5, a customer named Travis Lyle dropped off 2 rolls of Kodak film. I knew Travis slightly. He was maybe 26 or 27 and worked for a roofing company. He came in every few months to buy film because he liked taking pictures while driving around on weekends. Old barns, logging roads, waterfalls, that kind of thing. He filled out the envelope and asked for double prints. I asked if next morning was okay. He said that was fine and left. Nothing unusual about him. I closed at 6. My employee, Noreen, went home around 6:15, and I stayed in the back finishing the film. The first roll was normal. Mostly pictures of a lake, some trees, a dog, and what looked like his parents standing beside a motorhome. The second roll started with highway pictures. I ran the negatives through, checked them under the light, and started making prints. About halfway through, I got to 3 pictures that looked wrong. The first showed a field beside a 2-lane road. There was an old wooden fence running across the foreground and a row of power lines in the distance. Near the top right of the picture was a gray blur. It was oval, but not perfectly. I assumed something had gotten on the negative. I checked it. The negative was clean. The next frame showed almost the same view, except the camera had moved slightly to the left. The gray shape was there again. This time, it was closer to the center. The third frame was where I stopped working. The shape was lower, or at least it looked lower. It crossed in front of the top section of a telephone pole. That was why I knew it wasn't a cloud. It looked like a dull gray disc, although disc makes it sound more dramatic than it appeared. There weren't any clear edges. It was slightly out of focus and brighter along one side. I enlarged the print. That didn't help. It just made the grain more obvious. I went back through the negatives because I thought maybe there had been some kind of chemical mark. There wasn't. All 3 frames developed normally. The frames before and after them looked fine. I set the negatives on the light table and checked them with a magnifier. The object appeared directly on the film. What bothered me was its position. Between the first and second frames, it had shifted left. Between the second and third, it had dropped lower and gotten slightly larger. Travis had apparently taken the pictures within seconds of each other. The scene changed very little. I printed all 3 again at a larger size. Then I noticed something else. There was a pickup truck parked near the field. It was distant enough that I hadn't paid attention to it. In the first photograph, the driver's door was open. In the second, it was still open. In the third, the door was closed. That seemed odd because the pictures couldn't have been more than a few seconds apart. I looked for a person near the truck. I couldn't see anyone. I remember standing there with the magnifier thinking, Travis had finally photographed something genuinely strange. I wasn't thinking about flying saucers or anything like that. I thought it might have been a helicopter seen at a bad angle, maybe some kind of advertising balloon, even a bird blurred by movement. But I couldn't make it look like a bird. Around 7:10, I heard the front door open. The shop was closed, but the door didn't always latch correctly unless I locked the deadbolt. I was in the back room. I called out that we were closed. Nobody answered. I wiped my hands and went up front. 2 men were standing near the counter. Both wore dark suits. That wasn't common in my shop, especially on a rainy Tuesday evening. The older one was tall and narrow, maybe in his early 50s. He had short gray hair and a long face. The other was younger, maybe late 30s, with black hair that looked almost too carefully combed. Their coats were wet at the shoulders. Neither carried an umbrella. I said, "Sorry, we're closed." The older man smiled. He said, "We won't take much of your time, Mr. Keller." That bothered me immediately. My name was on the sign outside, so it wasn't impossible, but most customers called me Martin if they knew me at all. I asked what they needed. The younger man stayed near the door. The older man came closer to the counter. He said they were checking with photo processors in the area about possible film contamination. I asked what kind. He said, image anomalies. I remember those exact words because they sounded strange coming from somebody standing in a neighborhood camera shop. I asked who they worked for. He took out an identification case. He opened it toward me. There was a photo, some writing, and a seal. I saw the words Regional Materials Survey Office. I had never heard of it. I asked if it was state or federal. He said federal contract, not federal agency. Federal contract. I asked his name. He said, Mr. Harlan. The younger man gave his name as Pike. I never got first names. Harlan asked whether I'd developed anything unusual in the latest batch of film. I actually laughed a little because the timing was so strange. I said, what exactly are you looking for? He said defects sometimes appeared as discs, streaks, or bright patches across multiple frames. That wiped the smile off my face. I hadn't told anybody about Travis's pictures. Noreen had gone home before I processed them. Travis hadn't seen them yet. I asked how he knew what kind of defect to describe. Harlan said there had been an issue with a shipment of film sold in several counties. That sounded reasonable for about 2 seconds. Then I remembered Travis's rolls weren't fresh stock from my store. The Kodak canisters had old price stickers from a supermarket chain. I asked what brand and batch number they were looking for. Harlan didn't answer. Instead, he said, have you encountered anything matching that description today? I said no. I lied automatically. I don't know why. Maybe because 2 strangers had come into a locked-up shop and somehow described exactly what I'd just seen. Harlan watched me. He didn't seem offended or impatient. He just looked at me for a few seconds, longer than normal. Then Pike spoke from near the door. He said, you ran 2 35mm rolls after 6. My stomach tightened. I asked how he knew that. He said, we're checking a specific processing window. I told him that didn't answer my question. Neither man responded. Outside, a car passed on the wet road. I could hear its tires clearly. Inside the shop, the fluorescent lights started buzzing louder than usual. Harlan looked toward the back. Are the negatives still on site? That question changed everything for me. I said, what negatives? The latest batch. I told him customers' film was private property. He nodded. Of course. He didn't ask to see the prints. He didn't ask about the processing machine. He didn't ask for a sample of chemistry. He asked where I kept the negatives. I said I wasn't giving customer property to anyone without authorization. Harlan smiled again. We aren't asking for the photographs. He said it like he was correcting a misunderstanding. Then he added, only the negatives. I asked what good negatives would do if the problem was supposedly contaminated film. He said they needed to identify the emulsion defect. I told him Kodak could do that. He said Kodak isn't involved. The younger man walked away from the door and started looking at the display cases. He didn't seem interested in the cameras. He looked at reflections in the glass. That was the best way I could describe it. Every few steps, he stopped and looked toward the ceiling or the windows. I asked if they had a warrant. Harlan said no warrant was necessary because participation was voluntary. I said I wasn't participating. He nodded like that was completely acceptable. Then he asked, did the customer mention where the photographs were taken? I hadn't said there were photographs, not unusual photographs anyway. I said, I thought this was about bad film. He stared at me. Then he said, it is. I told them they needed to leave. Harlan looked past me toward the curtain leading to the processing room. For a moment, I was afraid he was just going to walk back there. He didn't. He reached inside his coat and handed me a plain white business card. It had only a telephone number printed on it. No name. No agency. No address. He told me to call if I found anything that looked like a repeated circular image across consecutive frames. Those were his words. Repeated circular image. I asked why. He said, so the customer doesn't receive damaged material. Then they left. I locked the door behind them. Their car was parked across the lot. It was a black sedan, older looking than I expected. Maybe a Ford Crown Victoria or something similar. I couldn't see the plate from inside. The men sat in it for several minutes. They didn't drive away. I went into the back and turned off the lights except for the darkroom safe light. I checked the 3 negatives again. The shape was still there. I don't know what I expected. I put Travis's film inside a clean envelope and hid it underneath a stack of old tax folders in the bottom drawer of my desk. Then I made another set of prints. While the machine was running, the telephone rang. I didn't answer. It rang 6 times and stopped. 30 seconds later, it rang again. I picked up. Nobody spoke. I could hear a low humming sound. I said hello twice. Then the line went dead. I checked the front window. The black sedan was gone. I left around 8:30. The parking lot was empty. It had started raining harder. I drove home by a longer route because I didn't want to go straight there if somebody was following me. That sounds paranoid now, but at the time it felt reasonable. About halfway home, I noticed headlights behind me. A car stayed about 3 lengths back through several turns. I couldn't tell what kind. At a yellow light, I went through. The car stopped. I didn't see it again. My wife, Dana, was already asleep when I got home. I didn't tell her much. I said 2 weird government-type guys had come into the shop asking questions. She told me I watched too many movies. The next morning, I arrived at 8. Travis wasn't due until after 9. The first thing I noticed was the front door. It was locked, but there was a thin scrape beside the lock cylinder that hadn't been there before. Inside, nothing looked disturbed. The cash drawer was untouched. Cameras were still in the cases. I went straight to my desk. The envelope with the negatives was still under the tax folders. I felt stupidly relieved. Then I checked the processing room. The large prints I'd made were gone. I had left them on a drying rack. All 6 enlarged prints were missing. The regular 4x6 prints were still in Travis's order envelope. I checked the trash. Nothing. I called Noreen at home and asked if she'd come in early. She hadn't. I called the police. An officer named Jeff Hardesty came by about 40 minutes later. He looked at the scrape on the lock, but said there was no clear sign anyone had actually entered. I told him about the missing prints. He asked if anything valuable had been taken. I said no. He looked confused when I told him what the prints showed. I didn't use the word UFO. I just said there was an unidentified object in some customer photographs and 2 men had asked about it the night before. He asked for the business card. I gave it to him. He called the number from the shop phone. A recorded voice answered. It said the number was not in service. Jeff tried again. Same thing. He wrote the number down. I asked if there was any agency called the Regional Materials Survey Office. He said he'd never heard of it. Around 10:15, Travis came in. I almost didn't give him the film. I asked where he'd taken the road pictures. He looked through the prints and said somewhere west of Junction City. He couldn't remember the road name. Then he reached the 3 frames. He stopped. I asked if he'd noticed the object when taking the pictures. He said, "What object?" I pointed it out. He stared at the prints for a long time. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. I stopped because of the truck. I asked what truck. He pointed to the pickup in the field. He said he'd been driving when he noticed a pickup sitting partly off a farm road with its driver's door open. He thought someone might need help. He pulled over and took a couple of pictures because the area looked strange in the fog. I asked if he'd gotten out. He said yes. He walked maybe 50 feet from his car. Then he heard a sound behind the trees. He described it as a generator starting up and immediately shutting down. After that, he noticed a bright reflection moving across the hood of the pickup. He couldn't figure out where it came from. He went back to his car. I asked how many pictures he'd taken. He said 3. I told him there were 4 frames between the second and third pictures. His expression changed. We looked at the negatives together. There were the 3 photographs with the gray object, but there was also 1 frame between them that I hadn't printed because it was almost completely dark. Under the magnifier, I could see a faint curved line across that frame. Travis said he didn't remember taking it. Then he asked whether anybody else had seen the film. I told him about Harlan and Pike. He became very quiet. I expected him to laugh. Instead, he asked what they looked like. When I described them, he said, "I saw the younger one yesterday." I asked where. He said the man had been standing outside a gas station in Junction City when Travis stopped for coffee before bringing me the film. He remembered him because the man was wearing a suit in the rain and didn't have a coat. I asked if they'd spoken. Travis said no. Then he corrected himself. He said the man had asked him for the time. That was it. Travis paid for the processing and took the prints. I gave him the negatives too. I almost kept a copy, but there was something about the whole situation that made me want it out of the shop. Before he left, I wrote down his phone number. He told me to call if the men came back. They came back that afternoon. Only this time it was just Harlan. He entered around 3:30 while two customers were browsing. He waited until they left. Then he walked to the counter. "Did you locate the affected negatives?" he asked. I told him the customer had picked them up. He didn't react. He asked when. I said that morning. He asked whether I made duplicate negatives. I said no. That was technically true. He asked whether I'd made enlargements. I lied and said no. He looked toward the back room. Then he asked for Travis's contact information. I refused. Harlan rested both hands on the counter. His fingernails were extremely clean. I noticed that for some reason. He said, "Mr. Keller, we'd prefer not to inconvenience the customer." I said, "Then leave him alone." He looked at me for several seconds, then he asked one final question. "Was there a dark frame between the visible images?" I didn't answer. He nodded slightly. That was the first time he looked satisfied. He thanked me and walked out. I went straight to the phone and called Travis. The number rang several times. He answered. I told him Harlan had come back asking about the negatives. Travis didn't say anything for a moment. Then he asked if the man was still there. I said no. He told me someone had been parked across from his apartment since noon. I asked what kind of car. He said a black sedan. I told him to call the police if he felt threatened. He said he already had. By closing time, nothing else happened. I locked everything carefully and drove home. The next morning, I found an envelope pushed through the mail slot at the shop. There was no writing on it. Inside were the 6 enlarged photographs that had disappeared. All 6. They were perfectly dry and undamaged. 5 looked exactly as I remembered them. The 6th had a black fingerprint near one corner. Not ink. It looked like soot. I took them into the back room and compared them with the small prints. Something was different. In the 3rd image, the one where the gray disc crossed the telephone pole, there had originally been a faint black mark underneath it. I remembered thinking it might have been a bird. On the returned enlargement, that mark wasn't there. I checked the small print. The mark was there. I called Travis. He answered and said he was fine. The black sedan had left sometime during the night. I asked him to check the 3rd negative. There was a long pause. Then he said, "Martin, there's nothing on these." I thought he meant the black mark. I asked what he was talking about. He said the gray shape was gone. I told him that was impossible. He brought the negatives back to the shop that afternoon. The 3 frames still showed the road, fence, telephone poles, and pickup truck. The gray object wasn't there. Not faintly, not partially. It simply wasn't on the negatives. The small prints I'd made still showed it clearly. Travis stood beside me while I checked every frame twice under the light. Neither of us said much. I put the negatives back in their sleeve and handed them to him. He went home before dark. I closed the shop at 6. Before leaving, I put the small prints in an envelope and locked them in the fireproof safe under my desk. Nothing else happened that evening. The next morning, the prints were still there. The men never came back. Travis stopped using the shop a few months later after he moved to Salem for work. I kept the 3 small prints for years. When I sold the business in 2006, I took them home with me, along with some personal paperwork. They stayed in a cardboard box in my garage. A few summers later, Dana and I cleaned the garage out. I opened the envelope. There were 3 photographs inside. Same wet road, same wooden fence, same power lines, same pickup sitting near the field. In all 3 pictures, the sky was empty. The power went out while I was standing in my kitchen pouring coffee into a travel mug. It was 5:42 in the morning. I knew because the microwave clock went black right in front of me. I lived outside Dayton, Ohio, in a small subdivision near Huber Heights, and at that hour in January it was completely dark outside. There had been freezing rain overnight, but by morning it had changed to a cold drizzle. The roads were wet, and there was a thin crust of ice on the grass and trees. My name was Greg Hanley. I was 45 then, and I worked as a maintenance supervisor at a packaging plant in Vandalia. Power outages weren't unusual in bad winter weather, so I didn't think much about it. I checked my phone. No internet through the house Wi-Fi, obviously, but cell service worked. I grabbed my coat and went outside because I wanted to see whether the whole street was dark. It was. Every house I could see had lost power. The streetlights were out too. What caught my attention was the sky to the east. There was a light moving above the electrical substation near Taylorsville Road. I knew the substation pretty well because I passed it almost every day on my way to work. It sat behind a chain-link fence between a warehouse property and a field. The light wasn't directly over my neighborhood. It was maybe a mile and a half away. At first, I assumed it was a helicopter. The utility company sometimes sent aircraft around after storms, and Wright-Patterson wasn't far away either, so seeing helicopters wasn't unusual. But this thing was moving too slowly. It was a pale orange light, about the brightness of a street lamp from a distance. It moved from left to right above the substation. No blinking, no red or green lights. I stood in my driveway for maybe a minute watching it. Then it stopped. It just hung there. I couldn't tell its height. Maybe a few hundred feet, maybe higher. The drizzle made the air hazy, so anything beyond the nearest rooftops looked soft around the edges. I went back inside for my keys. I don't know why I decided to drive closer. Partly curiosity, partly because if the power was out over a larger area, I wanted to know before heading to work. My wife, Denise, was still asleep upstairs. I left her a note on the counter saying I'd gone in early. The garage door opener didn't work, so I pulled the manual release and raised the door by hand. The whole neighborhood felt strangely quiet. No furnaces running, no television noise from houses, no streetlights, just rain hitting the pavement. I backed out and headed toward Taylorsville. The light was still visible whenever the trees opened up. It hadn't moved much. At the main road, traffic signals were dead. There were only a few cars out, and everybody was treating the intersections like four-way stops. As I got closer to the substation, I started seeing utility trucks. 2 were parked near an entrance road with their hazard lights on. I slowed down. The light was directly above the fenced equipment. From that distance, it looked larger, not brighter exactly. Larger. There seemed to be a dark shape around it. I couldn't make out a clear outline. It looked almost like the light was mounted underneath something flat, but the rain and darkness made it hard to judge. I pulled into the empty parking lot of a closed garden center across the road. There was another car there already, an older silver Buick. Its engine was running. I parked about 50 yards away from it. The person inside didn't get out. I rolled my window down. I expected to hear a helicopter rotor. There was nothing like that. I could hear transformer equipment humming inside the substation. Then there was a deeper sound underneath it, a low vibration. It wasn't loud. I felt it more through the steering wheel than I heard it. The orange light moved again, slowly. It drifted maybe 100 feet north, then stopped. A utility worker near the gate pointed upward. Another worker came over. They were clearly watching it too. That made me feel better in a strange way. At least I wasn't seeing something that wasn't there. Then the light changed color. It went from orange to white. The substation made a sharp snapping sound. There was a blue flash near one of the transformers. I ducked automatically. Nothing exploded. The white light above the station went dim for a second. Then every light in the garden center parking lot turned on at once. The power had come back. The store sign lit up. Street lights came on. The traffic signal down the road started flashing yellow while it reset. I looked back at the substation. The light was gone. I hadn't seen it leave. I checked the time on my dashboard. 6:03. That bothered me immediately. I had left my house around 5:47. The drive to the garden center should have taken less than 10 minutes, especially with almost no traffic. I couldn't account for 5 or 6 minutes, not a huge amount. Still, I sat there trying to remember every intersection I'd crossed. Nothing came to mind. The silver Buick started moving. It passed behind my truck on its way out. I saw the driver clearly for a second under the parking lot lights. He was a man wearing a dark coat. He looked straight ahead. I went to work. By 7, most of the plant had power again, although a couple of machines needed to be reset. I told one of our electricians, Marcus Bell, what I'd seen. He asked if it was one of the utility company's drones. I said it looked too big. He said maybe the mist had distorted the distance. That was reasonable. Around 9, I checked the utility company's outage map. There had been a major outage affecting several thousand customers. The cause was listed as equipment issue. By lunch, the wording had changed to weather-related. I noticed because I had refreshed the page a few times. That afternoon, I called the utility customer service line. I wasn't trying to make a big report. I just wanted to ask if they'd had a helicopter or drone above the substation. The woman who answered transferred me twice. Eventually, I got a man who said he worked in operations. I described the location. He asked what time. I said roughly 5:50 to 6:00. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked for my name and phone number. I asked if they had aircraft there. He said he didn't have that information. I asked whether anyone had reported a light. He said he couldn't discuss equipment incidents with the public. That was the end of the call. 2 days later, a utility company truck came through my neighborhood. It stopped near the end of our street. The driver got out and looked up at the poles. Normal enough after an outage. What wasn't normal was that he spent several minutes standing in the road looking toward my house. I watched through the front window. Eventually he drove away. I didn't connect it to anything at the time. 3 days after the blackout, I got a strange voicemail at work. Our receptionist, Leanne, transferred messages to department supervisors. The voicemail was from a man who said he was following up on the Taylorsville electrical event. He didn't give a company name. He asked me to call a number with a Washington, D.C. area code. I didn't. I assumed it was some kind of utility contractor. The next morning, 2 men showed up at the plant. I was on the production floor when Leanne called me. She said, "Greg, you've got visitors." I asked who. She lowered her voice and said, "I don't know. Government-looking guys." When I got to the lobby, both men were standing by the vending machines. They wore dark suits. Not identical, but close. One was probably in his late 50s with silver hair and a heavy face. The other was younger, maybe 35, very thin, dark hair cut short. Neither had an overcoat, even though it was around 30 degrees outside. The older man introduced himself as Leonard Cross. The younger one said his name was Evan Pike. Cross showed me credentials. I only saw them for a few seconds. There was a photograph and some kind of federal seal. The agency name said Office of Grid Resilience Coordination. I had never heard of it. I asked if they worked for the Department of Energy. Cross said they coordinated with several agencies. That wasn't really an answer. He said they were speaking with people who had observed unusual activity during the outage. I asked how they got my name. He said the utility company had forwarded witness contacts. That made sense because I'd given them my name and phone number. Still, something felt off. I asked if we could talk in the conference room rather than the lobby. Cross said that was fine. Leanne gave me a look as we walked past her desk. We went into a small meeting room near my office. Cross carried a black leather briefcase. Pike carried nothing. Once we sat down, Cross asked me to describe exactly what I'd seen. I told him about the orange light. I told him where I'd parked. I told him about the color change and the blue flash. He asked how long I watched it. I said maybe 10 minutes. He asked whether the light had moved in a straight line. I said mostly. He asked whether it had made turns. I said I hadn't seen any. Pike hadn't spoken yet. He sat across from me with his hands folded on the table. Cross asked whether there was any sound. I described the low vibration. Pike looked at Cross. It was quick, but noticeable. Cross asked if I had experienced headaches, ringing ears, or nausea. I said no. Then he asked whether my vehicle had stalled. I said no. He asked whether the dashboard clock changed. That caught my attention. I said, "Why are you asking about the clock?" Cross looked down at his notes. Electrical interference can affect vehicle electronics. I told him the truck had been running normally. He asked whether I'd lost any time. That phrasing bothered me. I said I didn't know what he meant. He said, "Was there any part of the incident you couldn't account for?" I told him the drive seemed to have taken a few minutes longer than it should have. Pike finally spoke. "How many minutes?" I said 5 or 6. He asked if I was certain. I said no. He nodded like that was what he expected. Cross closed his notebook. Then he said, "I'd like you to draw the light." I laughed. I thought he was joking. He wasn't. He took a sheet of plain white paper from his briefcase and put it in front of me. Then he handed me a black ballpoint pen. I said there wasn't much to draw. It was just a light. He said, "Draw whatever you perceived around it." That was a strange way to say it. I asked if other people had reported a shape. Neither man answered. So I drew what I remembered. I made a horizontal oval. Not a perfect disc, more like a flattened shape, slightly thicker in the middle. I put the light underneath it, off-center toward one side. Then I added 2 short marks along the top because I remembered seeing what looked like darker areas there when the parking lot lights came on. I stared at the drawing. It looked stupid, like a kid's sketch of a flying saucer. I almost crossed it out. Cross stopped me. "Don't alter it." I put the pen down. He asked if the proportions were accurate. I said I had no idea. He asked me to mark where the light changed from orange to white. I circled the small point underneath. Then he asked whether the darker marks on top were gaps or objects. I said I couldn't tell. Cross picked up the drawing. He looked at it for maybe 3 seconds. Then he turned it around toward Pike. Pike opened the briefcase. I thought he was going to put my drawing inside. Instead, he removed another sheet of paper. He laid it beside mine. For a second, I honestly didn't understand what I was looking at. It was another drawing. Different handwriting, different pen. But it showed almost exactly the same shape. Flattened oval, light underneath, slightly off-center, 2 dark marks on top. The proportions were so close that I looked from one to the other several times. I asked, "Who drew that?" Cross didn't answer. Pike aligned the 2 sheets by their bottom edges. Mine was a little wider. The light on the other drawing sat maybe half an inch farther toward the center. Otherwise, they looked nearly identical. I asked again who had drawn it. Cross said, "Another observer." I asked where. He said that wasn't relevant. I said it seemed pretty relevant to me. Pike quietly said, "It's within the same corridor." Cross looked at him. Pike stopped talking. I asked what corridor. Cross put the second drawing back into the briefcase. Then he asked me something that made my mouth go dry. "Did you see another vehicle in the garden center parking lot?" I said yes. He asked the color. "Silver." "Make?" "Buick, I think." "Occupants?" "1." He asked if I spoke to the driver. I said no. Pike asked whether the driver looked at me. I said not that I noticed. Cross asked whether I could identify him. I said probably not. Then Pike opened the briefcase again. Cross put one hand over it. Not roughly, just enough to stop him. They looked at each other for a second. Pike closed it. I asked what that was about. Cross said nothing. Then he asked whether I had photographed the light. I hadn't. I told him so. He asked whether I had called anyone from the parking lot. I said no. He asked whether anyone called me. I said no. Cross seemed satisfied. He collected my drawing. I reached for it. I said, "I'd like to keep that." He kept his hand on the paper. "We need it for comparison." I said he could make a copy. He looked at me for a moment. Then he slid it back. That surprised me. I thought he'd argue. Pike took out a phone and photographed the drawing. Just a normal-looking black phone. Then Cross stood. I asked what had caused the outage. He said the utility company was still reviewing it. I asked what the thing above the substation had been. He said they didn't know. I pointed toward the briefcase. Somebody else saw the same thing. Cross buttoned his jacket. He said, "People often describe unfamiliar lights in similar ways." I said, "Not that similar." He smiled slightly. Then he asked, "Did you tell anyone about the missing minutes?" I hadn't used the words missing minutes. I said, "I told you the drive seemed longer." He nodded. That's what I meant. They left. I watched them cross the parking lot. Their car was a dark gray sedan. Pike drove. Cross put the briefcase in the back seat before getting in. Leanne came over after they pulled away. She asked what federal agency they were with. I told her the name. She searched it on her computer. Nothing obvious came up. There were federal offices with similar words, but no Office of Grid Resilience Coordination. That afternoon, I searched government directories. Same result. I called the utility company again. This time I asked whether they'd sent my information to a federal office. The representative put me on hold. When she came back, she said there was no notation showing that my contact information had been shared outside the company. I asked about the 2 men. She said she couldn't verify them. That evening, I took my drawing home. Denise looked at it while we ate dinner. She said it looked like a hat. I told her about the other drawing. She stopped joking. She asked whether I got the men's business cards. I hadn't. That bothered me because I usually asked for cards whenever vendors visited the plant. I couldn't remember why I hadn't asked. A week passed. Nothing happened. Then Marcus came into my office one morning and asked whether I'd been having trouble with my truck. I said no. He told me a dark sedan had been sitting near it during lunch. 2 men were inside. He thought they were waiting for someone. When he walked closer, they drove away. I asked if they looked like the men who visited me. He hadn't seen them that day, so he couldn't say. A few nights later, I woke around 2 because the power flickered. The bedroom clock went dark and came back. Denise slept through it. I went downstairs. The power was still on. I looked out the kitchen window toward the east. There was no strange light, just clouds reflecting the orange glow from the city. I stood there maybe 5 minutes anyway. Nothing happened. By spring, I mostly stopped thinking about it. The utility company eventually replaced equipment at the substation. The outage report online still listed weather as the cause. About 6 months later, our plant hired a contractor to inspect the roof. His name was Scott Weller. I was walking him through the maintenance area when he noticed my drawing pinned beside my desk. I'd kept it there under a work schedule. He stopped. He asked, "Where did you get that?" I said I'd drawn it. His face changed. I asked why. He told me his brother-in-law worked night maintenance at a hospital near Springfield. During a power failure the previous winter, he'd seen a strange light above a transformer yard behind the building. I asked what it looked like. Scott reached for a notepad on my desk. He drew a flattened oval. Then he put a small circle underneath it, off-center. I asked whether his brother-in-law had talked to anyone about it. Scott said 2 investigators came to his house afterward. I asked what agency. He couldn't remember. Then he said, something with grid in the name. I took my original drawing down from the wall and put it in a drawer. Scott didn't ask anything else. That evening, I drove home by Taylorsville Road. The substation looked normal. It was hot and clear, nothing like the morning of the outage. I stopped at the garden center because it was open and I needed potting soil. When I came back outside, a silver Buick was parked across from my truck. Older model, engine running. A man sat behind the wheel. I couldn't see his face clearly through the windshield. I put the soil in the back of my truck. The Buick stayed there. I got in and started the engine. It still didn't move. I backed out. As I passed the Buick, the driver turned his head. It was Pike, or at least I was almost sure it was. Same thin face, same dark hair. He watched me drive past. He didn't follow. I went straight home. Denise was watering plants by the garage when I pulled in. I carried the soil around back, helped her finish, and stayed outside until it got dark. The power stayed on all night. I found the sedan a little after 7 in the morning, about 6 miles beyond a locked Forest Service gate that I had opened myself. I was working seasonal patrol in the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. This was in late September, a few years ago. My name was Nathan Rourke, and at the time I had been with the district for just over 4 years. That morning had started cold and foggy. Not winter cold, but enough that I had the heater running in the truck. There had been rain overnight and everything was wet. The gravel roads were soft in places and low cloud had settled into the hollows. My job that day was routine. I was supposed to check a series of backcountry service roads after the storm, look for washouts or fallen trees, and inspect 2 locked access gates before a contractor came through later in the week. The road where I saw the car was called Briar Run Service Road on our maps. It wasn't open to the public. There was a steel gate at the bottom, gate 14, with a Forest Service lock and a separate fire lock. I got there around 6:35. The gate was locked normally. I wrote down the condition, unlocked it, drove through, then closed and locked it behind me. I always did that because hunters and ATV riders would sometimes slip in if you left a gate standing open for even a few minutes. The road climbed for several miles through thick hardwood forest. There were no houses up there, no campgrounds, no trailheads, just old logging spurs, drainage cuts, and 1 radio repeater farther north. I was about 6 miles in when I came around a bend and saw a black car parked on the shoulder. I stopped hard enough that my thermos rolled off the passenger seat. It was a sedan, a big one. Black paint, clean body, dark windows. It looked like a Lincoln or maybe a Cadillac, though I couldn't tell the model right away. It didn't belong there. Even our government sedans rarely went onto those roads because the gravel was rough and deeply rutted in places. Contractors used pickups. Biologists used SUVs. Nobody sensible drove an expensive black sedan that far back. There were two men standing beside it. Both wore dark suits. For a few seconds, I honestly thought I had made a wrong turn somehow. The scene looked that out of place. One man stood near the trunk. The other was closer to the tree line. They weren't talking. They appeared to be waiting. I stayed in my truck and watched them. The older one noticed me first. He walked into the road and raised one hand. Not in a hurry, just enough to signal that he'd seen me. I rolled forward and stopped maybe 15 feet away. The man came to my window. He looked around 55. Gray hair, neatly cut, clean shaven. He wore a dark charcoal suit, white shirt, black tie, and polished shoes. The shoes were the first thing I noticed. There was mud everywhere. My boots were already coated in it. His shoes were nearly spotless. The other man stayed near the sedan. He was younger, maybe late 30s, thin, pale, with dark hair combed straight back. I rolled my window down halfway. The older man smiled. "Good morning." I asked if they were having car trouble. He said no. I asked how they'd gotten past the gate. He looked back down the road as though he didn't know which gate I meant. Then he said, "We have authorization." I asked from who. He said, "District Administration." That was vague enough that I immediately got suspicious. I told him this was a restricted service road and asked to see identification. He didn't argue. He took a leather wallet from his inside coat pocket and opened it. I saw a photograph, his name, and some kind of federal-looking emblem. The name was Victor Dane. Under it were the words Field Resource Assessment Office. I had never heard of that office. There were a lot of programs and contractors I didn't know personally, so that alone wasn't enough to make me think something was wrong. I asked what agency it was part of. He said, "Interdepartmental." That was his exact word. I asked what they were doing. He said, "Conducting a survey." I looked around. They had no visible equipment, no flagging tape, no measuring gear, no tablets, clipboards, sample bags, GPS units, cameras, or even backpacks, just the sedan. I asked what kind of survey. Dane glanced toward the younger man. "Environmental response." I said, "Response to what?" He smiled again. "Baseline conditions." Those two answers didn't fit together. I told him I needed to verify their access because the gate had been locked when I arrived. The younger man walked over. He didn't introduce himself at first. He stood slightly behind Dane and looked through my windshield into the cab. Not at me. At the dashboard. Then at the radio. Dane said, "This is Mr. Vale." Vale nodded once. I asked for his ID too. He showed me a credential wallet. Same emblem. Same office. The name said Elias Vale. I took out my notebook and wrote both names down. When I did that, Vale watched my hand. Dane asked, "Are you scheduled to be in this section today?" That annoyed me. I said yes. He asked how far north I planned to go. I asked why that mattered. He said they were trying to avoid interfering with normal operations. I told him normal operations included knowing who was on restricted roads. He nodded. Of course. I asked where their vehicle permit was. We issued temporary dashboard passes for some contractors. Dane said they had been told one wasn't necessary. I asked who told them that. He didn't answer. The fog was thick enough that I couldn't see much beyond the next bend. There was water dripping from the leaves. No wind, no birds calling. That part didn't register until later. The forest was unusually quiet. Vale looked toward the trees. Then he asked me if I'd noticed any damaged vegetation along the road. I said no. He asked, "Any trees with bark discoloration?" I said not that I'd noticed. Then he asked if I'd seen any animals. I remember thinking that was an odd question. I said I had seen 2 deer lower down. He asked what direction they were moving. I told him I didn't know. Dane gave him a quick look. Vale stopped asking questions. I radioed the district office. There was usually poor reception up there, but our vehicle radios hit a repeater. I called for Miriam Holt, our operations coordinator. Static. I tried again. Nothing. That wasn't completely unusual in that drainage, but I had used the radio there before. Dane looked at the antenna on my truck. "Reception is inconsistent here," he said. I looked at him. I asked if he'd been there before. He said, "We've reviewed the area." Again, not really an answer. I told them I needed to continue my inspection and would be checking their authorization. Dane said that was fine. Then he asked how long I expected to be gone. I said I wasn't sure. He nodded. 20 minutes? I hadn't said 20 minutes. I told him maybe longer. He smiled. We should be finished by then. I drove past them. As I passed the sedan, I looked for a license plate. There was one, government-style white plate, but it was covered in enough road grime that I couldn't make out the numbers. That struck me as strange because the rest of the car was extremely clean. The road continued uphill for about a mile before reaching an old junction. I stopped there because I finally got a radio signal. I called Miriam. She answered. I gave her the names and office. She hadn't heard of the Field Resource Assessment Office. I asked if anyone had authorization to be beyond Gate 14. She checked. Nobody did. No survey crews, no federal partners, no vehicles. She told me to stay where I was while she called our law enforcement officer. I said the men weren't threatening. They were polite. I just wanted someone else there before I pushed the issue. Miriam told me that Caleb Norris, another ranger, was only a few miles away checking a trailhead. She sent him toward me. I parked at the junction and waited. The fog moved slowly through the trees. My radio worked normally from that point. I called the district office again and asked if they could check the names. Miriam said she was doing it. About 5 minutes later, I heard an engine somewhere down the road. I assumed it was Caleb. The sound was faint. Then it stopped. I waited. No vehicle appeared. I got out of the truck. I could hear water running in a ditch. Then I heard a metallic tapping sound deeper in the woods. 3 taps. A pause. 2 more. It sounded like someone striking a pipe with a small hammer. I called out. Nobody answered. The tapping stopped. A minute later, Caleb came from the opposite direction than I expected. He had entered from another service road that connected farther north. He pulled up beside me and asked what was going on. I explained. He laughed at first. 2 guys in suits? I said yes. In a sedan? Yes. He thought I was messing with him. Then he saw I wasn't. We turned around and drove back toward the spot together. I followed him. It couldn't have been more than 20 minutes since I'd left the men. Maybe 22. When we came around the bend, the sedan was gone. So were Dane and Vale. At first, I assumed they'd driven back toward the gate. Then I remembered the gate was locked. I had the key. Caleb got out. He looked at the tire tracks. There were clear marks in the wet gravel where the sedan had been parked. The tracks pulled onto the road heading south, toward the gate. We drove after them, slowly at first. The road was muddy enough that a car should have left obvious tracks. For about half a mile, we could see them. Then they disappeared. Not gradually. There was a wet section of road where the tire marks were clear. 20 feet later, nothing. Caleb stopped his truck. We got out. The road ahead was soft. Our boot prints showed immediately. Any vehicle would have left marks. There were none. We walked around looking for a side spur. There wasn't one. The uphill bank was too steep for a car. The downhill side dropped into thick trees. No skid marks, no broken brush, no disturbed soil. Caleb asked if maybe they'd turned around. I said the tracks were heading south. He crouched and looked at them. He agreed. We continued to gate 14. It was still locked. Same padlock, same position. The chain hadn't been cut. There were no tracks through the ditch beside it. No way around without hitting trees. Caleb looked at me and said, "You're sure that wasn't parked before you opened the gate?" I said yes. He asked if maybe there was another road out. I told him not for a sedan. There was an old logging spur farther west, but it had been blocked by concrete barriers for years. We unlocked the gate and checked the road outside. No black sedan, Miriam called. She said she couldn't find any federal office by the name I'd given her. She had also checked with the regional headquarters. Nobody knew about a survey. Our law enforcement officer, Mark Blevins, arrived about 40 minutes later. We went back up with him. By then, the fog was lifting. Mark photographed the tire impressions where the sedan had been parked. He asked me to describe the men. I did. He asked if they'd threatened me. No. Asked for access to buildings? No. Tried to take anything? No. I told him they had mostly asked questions about vegetation and animals. He wrote that down. Then I remembered the radio comment. I told him Dane had said reception was inconsistent before I'd mentioned that my radio wasn't working. Mark paused. He asked, He knew your radio wasn't working? I said I didn't know if he knew. Maybe he was just making conversation. Mark checked the area around the shoulder. Behind where the sedan had been parked, he found several circular impressions in the mud. They looked like something heavy had rested there. Not tires. 3 round marks, each maybe 4 inches across. They formed a rough triangle. Caleb thought they might have been from survey equipment. I said the men hadn't had any. Mark photographed those too. We spent another hour checking nearby spurs. Nothing. I finished my shift and went home around 4. My wife, Rachel, noticed I was distracted. I told her most of it. She said maybe they were intelligence people doing something they couldn't talk about. That sounded more reasonable than anything else. For the next few days, nothing happened. Then Miriam called me into her office. She had received an email from a regional account asking for copies of my incident notes. The message referred to an unauthorized contact with external field personnel. That wording seemed strange. I asked who had sent it. She showed me. The address ended in .gov, but the office name was just Operations Review. No person listed. Miriam forwarded my notes. The next morning she got a reply. It said the individuals were verified federal contractors and no further action was required. I asked which agency. The reply didn't say. Miriam tried calling the number in the signature. It went to a generic voicemail. About a week later, I was assigned back to Briar Run. The weather had changed completely. It was warm for late September, sunny, almost no wind. I didn't want to go alone, so Caleb came with me. Gate 14 was locked. We opened it and drove up. When we reached the spot where I'd seen the sedan, there was nothing there. The circular impressions were gone after several days of rain. Caleb got out to check a drainage culvert. I stayed near the trucks. That's when I noticed something tied to a branch about 20 feet into the woods. It looked like a strip of black fabric. I walked over. It wasn't fabric. It was a narrow black necktie. Plain, no pattern. It was draped over a low branch as neatly as if someone had hung it there. I called Caleb. He came over. We both stared at it. He asked if it was mine. I said no. Neither of us touched it. Caleb took a picture. We called Mark. He told us to leave it there until he could come up. Mark arrived that afternoon. The tie was gone. Caleb still had the photograph. Mark looked around but found nothing. He joked that maybe a hunter had taken it. Hunting season hadn't opened yet. A few nights later, I got a phone call at home. The number was blocked. I answered because my father had been in the hospital that month and sometimes called from different numbers. A man said, "Mr. Rourke?" I said yes. The voice was calm. He asked, "Has the road remained accessible?" I asked who was calling. There was a pause. Then the man said, "Gate 14. I sat up. I asked again who it was. The line went dead. I reported it to Mark the next day. There wasn't much he could do with a blocked call. After that, I started checking my mirrors when I left work. For about 2 weeks, I noticed the same dark sedan on 3 different occasions. Once outside a gas station, once behind me on Route 219, once parked across from the district office. I couldn't prove it was the same car. There were plenty of black sedans. Each time, I only saw one person inside. I never got a clear look. Then one afternoon, I came out of a grocery store in Elkins and saw a man standing beside my truck. Dark suit, gray hair. For half a second, I thought it was Dane. I stopped walking. The man looked at me. He was older than Dane and heavier, completely different face. He apologized and said he'd mistaken my truck for someone else's. Then he walked away. That was the point where I realized how much the whole thing had gotten into my head. I stopped talking about it at work unless someone else brought it up. Winter came. The service roads closed because of snow. Nothing else happened. In March, we had a planning meeting for spring maintenance. Miriam handed out updated access maps. Briar Run was on mine. Next to Gate 14 was a new note printed in red. Restricted pending environmental review. I asked what review. Miriam said she didn't know. She'd gotten the map from the regional office. I asked how long the restriction lasted. No end date was listed. That summer, contractors installed a new gate about a mile beyond Gate 14. Nobody in our district had requested it. The paperwork said it was funded through an outside federal program. The new gate used a different lock. We weren't given keys. A small metal sign beside it read, "Authorized survey personnel only." There was no agency name. I stayed with the district another year. I never went beyond that second gate. On my last week before transferring to another forest, Caleb and I drove Briar Run one final time to inspect a culvert. It was late afternoon and raining lightly. We stopped at the new gate, still locked. Caleb got out to check the drainage ditch. I stayed in the truck. Farther up the road, beyond the gate, I saw something dark through the trees. At first, I thought it was a shadow. Then I realized it was a car, a black sedan, parked facing us. I could make out the windshield and roof. No headlights. I couldn't see anyone inside. I called Caleb back. He got into the passenger seat. By the time he looked up the road, the fog had moved across it. He asked where the car was. I pointed. We waited. The fog thinned maybe 30 seconds later. The road was empty. Caleb didn't say anything. I put the truck in reverse. We backed down until I found enough room to turn around. I locked gate 14 behind us, drove back to the district office, finished the inspection report, and went home. The light had been sitting above the apartment building across from mine for so long that I finally called the police. This happened in February, during a stretch of cold weather in Milwaukee. My name was Rachel Devlin. I was 32 at the time and living by myself in a third-floor apartment on the east side, a few blocks from Lake Michigan. It was around 11 at night. There had been light snow earlier, but by then it had stopped. The sky was cloudy and low, and there was that orange glow you got over the city when snow was on the ground. I had been sitting at my kitchen table working on invoices for a dental office where I handled billing. My apartment was small. Kitchen in the back, living room facing the street, one bedroom, one bathroom. The building across from me was taller, maybe 6 floors. I knew a few people who lived there, but not well. The light was above its roof. At first I noticed it because I thought it was a star. Then I realized I couldn't see any other stars. It was white, maybe slightly yellow, and brighter than a normal aircraft light. What made me keep looking was that it didn't move. Planes came over that neighborhood all the time, especially farther south toward the airport, and helicopters weren't rare either. This stayed in exactly the same place. I watched it through the living room window for maybe 5 minutes. Then I made tea. When I came back, it was still there. I checked the time. 10:48. I turned off the lamp beside the couch so I could see outside better. The light appeared to be several hundred feet above the building. That was only a guess. Without anything near it, I couldn't tell how large or distant it was. Every minute or so, it seemed to dim slightly, then brighten again. Not blinking, more like somebody was slowly turning a dimmer switch. I opened the window. Cold air came in immediately. I expected to hear an engine. I heard traffic a few streets over. I heard somebody scraping ice off a car. I heard a bus. Nothing from the light. I took out my phone and tried to record it. On the screen, it looked like a tiny blurry dot. I zoomed in. That only made it worse. While I was recording, something strange happened in the building across the street. A hallway light on the top floor went out. Then another one. I could see the lit windows through the stairwell at the end of the building. They went dark one after another from top to bottom, not all at once. Top floor, then 5th, then 4th. It took maybe 10 seconds. The apartment windows stayed lit, just the stairwell. I stopped recording. The white light above the roof dimmed at exactly the same time the last hallway light went dark. Then it brightened again. A dog started barking somewhere behind the building. It barked continuously for maybe 30 seconds. Then another dog joined in farther away. I remember thinking that maybe somebody was flying a drone and the dogs could hear it. That seemed reasonable. I searched online for drone lights. Some looked similar, but most drones moved, even when hovering. They drifted. This didn't. At 11:02, I called the police non-emergency number. I felt stupid doing it. I told the dispatcher there was a stationary light above the building across from mine and that it had been there for at least 15 minutes. She asked if I thought it was an aircraft. I said I didn't know. She asked if it was shining anything at people or buildings. I said no. She asked if I saw smoke or fire. No. She said she'd make a note and send someone if a unit was nearby. I thanked her and hung up. I kept watching. Around 11:10, the light began moving. Very slowly. It moved sideways to the north. Not enough that I would have noticed if I hadn't been staring directly at it. Then it stopped again. A few seconds later, my television turned on. I hadn't touched the remote. It came onto a blue input screen with no signal. I walked over and shut it off. The moment the screen went dark, I heard 3 light taps on the living room window. I froze. I was on the 3rd floor. There wasn't a balcony outside that window. I stood there for several seconds, telling myself it had been ice or something falling from the roof. Then I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. Same window. Not loud. I didn't go closer. I backed toward the kitchen. The light outside was still visible from where I stood. Then it went out. The whole thing disappeared instantly. No fading, no movement, just gone. I looked at my phone, 11:16. A police cruiser came by around 11:25. It slowed in front of the building across the street, then continued around the block. Nobody knocked on my door. The stairwell lights across the street came back on sometime after midnight. I went to bed around 1. I didn't sleep well, mostly because every sound from the radiator or plumbing made me look toward the living room. The next morning, there was nothing unusual outside. I watched the video I'd taken. It showed the light, but not clearly enough to prove anything. Near the end of the recording, the image shook because my hand had moved. The strange part was the audio. There was a low buzzing sound I hadn't heard while recording. I listened with headphones. It was steady for most of the clip. Then, just before I stopped recording, it changed pitch. Maybe my phone microphone had picked up interference. I saved the video and went to work. Nothing happened for the next couple of days. I told my coworker, Jenna Price, about it. She thought it was probably a drone. I agreed. It was easier to leave it there. On Friday afternoon, I got a call from the property manager. His name was Alan Weiss. He said 2 men had come to the building asking for me. I asked who they were. He said they claimed to be following up on a police report. I asked if they were officers. He said they hadn't said. I was at work and told him not to let anyone into my apartment. He said he hadn't. That evening, when I got home around 6, there was nobody waiting. I checked the hallway. Normal. I ate dinner. Around 7:30, somebody knocked. I looked through the peephole. 2 men stood outside. Both wore dark suits. One was older, maybe late 50s, with gray hair and a narrow face. The other looked around 40. Dark hair, pale skin. Neither wore a winter coat. That was the first thing that seemed wrong. It was below freezing outside. I left the chain on and opened the door a few inches. The older man smiled. "Miss Devlin?" I said yes. He introduced himself as Thomas Reed. The younger man said his name was Warren Hale. Reed showed me identification through the gap. There was a photograph and an official-looking seal. The words on it said, Municipal Aviation Coordination Office. I had never heard of that. I asked what that was. Reed said they worked with local agencies on aviation-related reports. I asked if the police sent them. He said, "Your report was forwarded." That wasn't exactly an answer. I asked to see the ID again. He showed it. The photo looked like him. I still couldn't tell what agency it belonged to. I asked if they had business cards. Reed reached into his jacket, checked one pocket, then another. He said he'd run out. Hale didn't move. I almost closed the door. Then Reed said, "We only need a few minutes concerning the light you observed Wednesday night." That made me hesitate. I hadn't posted about it anywhere. Only the police, Jenna, and my property manager knew. I unhooked the chain but stayed near the door. They came in. Both looked around the apartment in a way that made me uncomfortable. Not openly searching, just noticing everything. Reed asked if we could sit. We went to the kitchen table. Hale remained standing for a moment before sitting beside him. Reed took out a small notebook. Friend, he asked what time I first noticed the light. I said around 10:45. He asked how long I watched it before calling police. I said maybe 15 minutes. He asked whether the object moved vertically. I said no. He used the word object. I hadn't. I said, "I don't know that it was an object. It was just a light." He nodded. "Of course." He asked about color, brightness, whether it pulsed, whether I saw smaller lights near it. I said no. Then he asked whether I heard any noise. I said no. Hale looked at me. "What about inside the apartment?" I asked what he meant. "Any electrical sounds, vibrations, clicking." I thought of the window. I didn't want to tell them. I said my television had turned on by itself. Reed wrote that down. He asked what time. I said I didn't know exactly. Hale said 11:14. I looked at him. He looked back without expression. I said, "How would you know that?" Reed answered, "The dispatch record gives us a useful timeline." I said I hadn't called back to tell anyone about the television. Neither man spoke for a second. Then Reed said Hale was estimating. Hale didn't confirm that. Reed asked if I'd recorded anything. I said yes. He asked to see the video. I showed it on my phone. He watched once. Then he handed the phone to Hale. Hale didn't watch the screen much. He held the phone near his ear and listened. When the clip ended, he asked me to play it again. I did. He listened a second time. Then he asked, "You didn't hear that while you were recording?" I said no. He handed the phone back. I asked what he heard. He said, "Nothing definitive." Reed changed the subject. He asked which room I had been in when I first noticed the light. I said the living room. He asked whether I remained in the same location. I said mostly. Then he asked a very specific question. "Which window did you observe it through?" I pointed vaguely toward the living room, the front one. Reed nodded. Hale stood up. Without asking anything else, he walked out of the kitchen. He went straight through the living room, straight to the left-hand window. Not the larger center window, not the narrow one beside the bookshelf. The left window, the exact one I'd stood at. I hadn't pointed to it. I hadn't described it. I hadn't even walked them into the living room before that. Hale stopped in front of it and looked outside. My stomach dropped. I said, "How did you know which one?" He didn't answer. Reed got up. I asked again. Hale looked at the window latch, then at the ceiling above it. He said, "This was open." I said, "For a little while." "How far?" I stared at him. Reed came into the room. He said, "We're trying to determine viewing angle." I said, "No, you're not." He walked directly to the window. Reed smiled slightly. "It's the clearest view of the opposite roofline." That wasn't true. The center window had a better view. I pointed that out. Neither responded. Hale put 2 fingers against the window glass. Then he looked down at the sill. He asked whether I'd cleaned it since Wednesday. I said no. He crouched. There was a tiny dark mark on the white paint near the corner. I hadn't noticed it before. It looked like a little burn spot, maybe the size of a pencil eraser. Hale looked at it for several seconds. Then he stood. Reed asked, "Did you touch this?" I said I hadn't even known it was there. He asked if anyone else had been in the apartment. I said no. Hale opened his jacket and took out a folded white tissue. He rubbed the mark. Some of it came off as gray powder. He folded the tissue and put it in his pocket. I said, "What exactly are you doing?" Reed told him that was enough. Then he turned to me. "Did you hear tapping at this window?" That was when I wanted them out. I hadn't mentioned tapping. Not to the dispatcher, not to Jenna, not to Alan. Nobody. I said, "Why would you ask that?" Reed's expression barely changed. "Because you mentioned electrical disturbances." "No, you asked about tapping." He closed the notebook. Hale looked outside again. The building across the street was clearly visible. It was early evening and lights were coming on in apartments. He asked, "Did anyone appear on the roof?" I said no. "Any movement in the upper windows?" No. "Any animals reacting?" I thought of the dogs. I said no. He watched me for a second. I think he knew I was lying. Reed thanked me for my time. I told them I wanted their office number before they left. He gave me one. I wrote it on the back of an envelope. Then I asked what they thought the light had been. Reed said they were collecting reports of unauthorized aviation activity. I asked whether that meant a drone. He said, "Possibly." Hale turned away from the window. As he did, I noticed there was something small attached to the inside of his jacket near the lapel. Not a badge. It looked like a black plastic earpiece cord disappearing under his shirt. That wasn't especially strange. What bothered me was that he touched it immediately after looking across the street. Then he said, "We're finished." Reed gave me another polite smile. They walked out. I locked the door behind them. I watched through the peephole until they reached the stairwell. Then I went to the living room window. A black sedan was parked across the street. It hadn't been there when I got home. Hale and Reed came out of my building and got in. The car stayed parked for another 5 minutes. Neither man appeared to be using a phone. Then they drove away. I called the number Reed had given me. A recording said the number had been disconnected. I called the police non-emergency line. I explained that 2 men had come to my apartment claiming to follow up on my report. The dispatcher checked. She said she didn't see any notation about another agency being assigned. I asked whether the Municipal Aviation Coordination Office was real. She said she'd never heard of it. A patrol officer came by about an hour later. His name was Officer Ben Morrow. I described both men. He looked at the dark mark on the windowsill. By then, only a faint gray stain remained. He asked if anything had been stolen. Had they threatened me? No. Had they refused to leave? No. There wasn't much he could do. He did write a report. Before leaving, he asked if I'd let the men into the apartment voluntarily. I said yes. He suggested I not do that again unless I could verify who they were. I agreed. That night, I pulled the blinds closed. Around 1 in the morning, I woke because of a low humming sound. I sat up in bed. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. I checked the living room. Nothing was on. The window was closed. I didn't look outside. The next morning, I found a thin line of gray powder on the windowsill. It started near the small dark mark and ran about 4 inches toward the glass. I wiped it up with a damp paper towel. For the next week, I stayed with Jenna. Nothing happened. When I came back, everything in the apartment looked normal. The building across the street looked normal. I started keeping the blinds closed after dark. About a month later, I ran into Alan near the mailboxes. He asked whether the federal guys had ever come back. I said no. Then I asked how they'd known which apartment was mine when they first came looking. He said they hadn't asked. I thought I'd misunderstood. I said, "What do you mean?" He told me he'd been in the lobby when they entered. Before he could even greet them, the younger man had walked to the directory, looked at it for maybe a second, and said, "Third floor, left side." My name wasn't listed on the directory, only apartment numbers. Alan said he'd thought I had already spoken with them. I hadn't. I moved out when my lease ended that summer. On my last day after the movers left, I stood in the empty living room and checked the window one more time. The gray mark was gone. The paint looked clean. I locked the apartment, gave Alan my keys, loaded the last box into my car, and drove to my new place before sunset. The sedan came in just before closing on a Tuesday, and the first thing I noticed was how clean it was underneath. I worked at a small, independent garage outside Fort Collins, Colorado. My name was Darren Pike. I was 43 at the time, and I'd been a mechanic since I was 19. The shop sat on the edge of town near a row of storage units and an irrigation canal. Behind us were open fields that eventually gave way to newer subdivisions. It had been hot all day, but a storm was building over the foothills, and by 6, the sky had gone dark enough that we turned the parking lot lights on early. There were 3 of us working that evening. Me, my cousin Joel, and a younger guy named Mateo Ruiz. We normally closed at 6. At about 5:40, a black sedan pulled into the lot. It was a large American car, maybe 5 or 6 years old. Nothing exotic. Black paint, dark interior, steel wheels with plain hubcaps. The driver got out. He was tall, thin, probably late 40s, wearing a dark suit. That looked strange because it had been around 90 degrees that afternoon. He wasn't sweating. He came inside and said the car had developed a vibration at highway speed. I asked how bad. He said, persistent. That was the word he used. I asked whether he felt it through the steering wheel or the seat. He looked at me for a second. Through the structure. I thought maybe he didn't know much about cars. I asked him to be more specific. He said it started around 55 miles an hour and stopped below 40. No pulling, no noise, just vibration. I told him we were nearly closed and could look at it first thing in the morning. He said he'd prefer that we inspect it immediately. I told him we'd probably only have time to put it on the lift and check tires, suspension, drive shaft, that kind of thing. He said that was sufficient. I wrote up the ticket. When I asked for his name, he said Adrian Moss. I asked for a phone number. He gave me one with a Denver area code. And then I asked for the mileage. He said approximately 41,000. Most people just looked at the odometer. Moss didn't. I went outside and checked it myself. 408. There was nothing obviously unusual about the interior. No police equipment, no government plates, no radios, just a clean black sedan with cloth seats and almost nothing inside. There wasn't even junk in the cup holders. I drove it around the block. At neighborhood speed, it felt normal. I got it up to about 50 on the frontage road. At around 48, I felt a faint vibration through the floor. By 55, it was definitely there. It wasn't violent, more like a low buzzing through the seat rails and pedals. I couldn't tell whether it was tire-related or coming through the drivetrain. Then the radio made a single click. It wasn't turned on. I looked at it. The display stayed dark. A few seconds later, it clicked again. I thought maybe there was an electrical issue too. I turned around and went back. Moss was standing outside the shop when I pulled in. He hadn't moved his own ride because there wasn't another vehicle. I assumed someone was coming to get him. I told him we'd put the sedan on the lift. He asked if he could wait outside. I said sure. Joel brought the car into Bay 3. We raised it. The tires looked almost new. No obvious bulges, no uneven wear. The wheel weights were in place. I checked the steering components, control arms, tie rods, bushings. Everything seemed ordinary. Then I got underneath the center of the car. That's where things started feeling wrong. The exhaust system looked new. Not replacement shop new. Factory new. Almost no corrosion. That wasn't impossible in Colorado, but the car had over 40,000 miles. I looked at the muffler. There was a flat area where the manufacturer's stamp should have been. At first I thought it was just a generic aftermarket part. Then I noticed the same thing on one of the suspension components. A section of metal had been ground smooth, not damaged, carefully ground. The marking had been removed. I called Joel over. He looked at it and said, "That's weird." We started checking. Several parts had missing markings: a rear shock, a bracket near the fuel tank, a drive shaft coupling, one of the exhaust hangers. Even 2 bolt heads had been polished enough that whatever had been stamped into them was gone. It wasn't random wear. Someone had intentionally removed identifying marks. Mateo came over. He thought maybe it was a prototype vehicle. I said it wasn't. The make and model were normal. We'd worked on several of them. Then I noticed the fuel tank didn't look quite right. The shape was correct, but there was an extra metal shield underneath it. It had been installed cleanly. No rough welds, no obvious aftermarket brackets. I tapped it with the handle of my screwdriver. The sound was dull. Joel asked what I was looking for. I said I didn't know. Then the shop lights flickered. Once, twice. The radio playing on Mateo's bench cut out for about 2 seconds. When it came back, it wasn't on the same station. It was just static. Mateo laughed and blamed the storm. Thunder was getting closer outside, so that seemed reasonable. I kept inspecting the sedan. Near the rear axle, I found a small rectangular metal housing. It wasn't connected to anything I recognized. There were wires going into it, but they disappeared behind the body shielding. It could have been part of an aftermarket alarm or tracking system. I tried to find a label. Nothing. The surface had been sanded smooth. I didn't open it. That mattered later. I want to be clear about that. I didn't remove anything from the car. I didn't disconnect anything. I just looked. Joel suggested we road force balance the tires in the morning. I agreed. I lowered the car. Moss came in from outside almost immediately. That was strange because he couldn't see Bay 3 from where he'd been standing. He asked what we'd found. I told him nothing obvious. I mentioned the tires looked good and the suspension was tight. I didn't mention the removed markings. He asked if the vehicle could be driven. I said yes. Then I told him we'd need more time to diagnose the vibration. He looked toward the car. "I'll leave it overnight." That surprised me. He had seemed determined to get it checked immediately. I asked if someone was picking him up. He said yes. A few minutes later, another black sedan entered the lot. Same general size. A man in a dark suit was driving. Moss got in the passenger side. Before leaving, he came back inside and asked whether anyone else would be working on his car. I said, "Just us." He looked at Mateo, then at Joel. "Only the 3 of you?" I said yes. He nodded. Then he asked, "Does the building remain occupied overnight?" I told him no. That question stayed in my head. After they left, we closed up. The storm broke around 7. Heavy rain, wind, lightning. I drove home to Wellington about 15 minutes north. Around 10:30, my shop alarm company called. The motion sensor in Bay 3 had triggered. I checked the camera feed on my phone. The system was old and the image wasn't great. The bay looked empty except for Moss's sedan on the floor. Nothing moved. The alarm company asked if I wanted police dispatched. I said no. The storm had probably caused something. 5 minutes later, another sensor triggered. Same bay. I looked again. Nothing. Then the camera froze. The timestamp stopped at 10:36:14. It stayed frozen for almost a minute. When the feed resumed, the sedan looked exactly the same. I almost drove back to the shop. Instead, I reset the alarm remotely and went to bed. The next morning, I arrived at 7:15. Joel was already there. He was standing beside Bay 3, staring at the sedan. I asked what was wrong. He said, "Did you move this?" I said no. He pointed to the floor. We had painted alignment marks near the lift because the concrete was cracked in that area. The sedan had been parked with the front tires just behind one of those lines. Now the tires were about six inches ahead of it. Maybe Joel had positioned it differently than I remembered. That was possible. Then he showed me the driver's seat. It was farther back than where I'd left it. Again, not impossible. Maybe Moss had adjusted it before leaving. I didn't remember. We put the car back on the lift. The vibration could easily have been a wheel balance issue, so we started there. All 4 tires balanced almost perfectly. No bent rims, no obvious tread problem. I checked the underside again. The rectangular metal housing near the rear axle was gone. I actually thought I was looking in the wrong place. I moved my work light around. Nothing. The bracket was still there. 2 small mounting holes. But the box itself wasn't. I called Joel over. He stared at it. He remembered it too. Mateo came in around 8. He remembered the housing clearly because he joked that it looked like a garage door opener. I checked the security camera recording. At 10:36, the footage froze. When it resumed 58 seconds later, nobody appeared in the shop. No doors opened. No exterior alarm had triggered. I called the alarm company. They said the system had briefly lost communication during the storm. Nothing more. We decided not to touch the car beyond what was necessary. I road tested it again. The vibration was still there. At exactly 55, the low buzzing returned. This time I noticed something in the rearview mirror. There was a black SUV about 3 cars behind me. Probably nothing. I turned onto a side street. The SUV turned too. I made another turn. It stayed behind me. Then I headed back toward the shop. The SUV continued straight. When I pulled into the garage, there were 2 men waiting in the office. Neither was Moss. Both wore dark suits. Joel was talking to them. The older one introduced himself as Graham Voss. The younger one said his name was Neil Mercer. Voss said they were there to collect Mr. Moss's vehicle. I asked if Moss had authorized them. Voss produced a signed-looking form. The signature looked like the one on the repair order. I said we hadn't fixed the vibration. He said that was fine. Then he asked what we'd found. I explained the wheel balance was good and there wasn't an obvious suspension issue. He didn't ask about cost, didn't ask what we'd recommend next. Instead, he said, "What did you observe underneath?" That wording caught me. I said, "Normal inspection stuff." He looked directly at me. "Anything unusual?" I asked what he meant. He said, "Non-standard parts, modifications, damage." Joel went quiet. I said we'd seen some parts without identifying marks. Voss nodded. He wasn't surprised. Mercer asked, "Which parts?" I gave him a few examples. He took out a small notebook and wrote them down. Then he asked whether I'd photographed anything. I said no, that wasn't completely true. Mateo had taken one picture with his phone to show the ground-down marking on the shock. I didn't know that until later. Voss asked whether we'd removed any components. I said no. Disconnected wiring? No. Opened housings? No. He glanced at Mercer. Mercer said, "You noticed the housing?" I hadn't told them that. I said, "What housing?" He didn't answer. Voss asked where the vehicle had been stored overnight. I pointed to Bay 3. He asked whether anyone had entered the shop. I said not according to the alarm. Then he asked about the camera interruption. I stared at him. I hadn't mentioned the camera. I asked how he knew. He said Moss had received a security notification from the vehicle. That made no sense to me. If the car had its own alarm, it hadn't gone off. I asked what kind of notification. Voss ignored the question. He asked exactly when the camera feed had stopped. I said around 10:36. Mercer corrected me. 10:36 and 14 seconds. The exact timestamp. Joel looked at me. Voss gave Mercer a quick look, then asked if we could inspect the shop's security recording. I said no. He asked why. I told him customer vehicle pickup didn't include access to my cameras. He accepted that surprisingly easily. Then he asked another question. Did the vibration change after the interruption? I said I didn't know. He asked whether I had driven the vehicle before and after. I said yes. He wanted the speeds. I gave him rough numbers. Mercer asked if I'd heard any clicking from the dashboard. I didn't answer right away. I had heard it on the first test drive. I asked why. He said some electrical faults present acoustically. Nobody I knew talked like that. I told him I'd heard 2 clicks. He wrote that down. Boss finally asked how much they owed. The diagnostic bill was $85. He paid cash, exact amount. No tax calculation issue because Joel had already printed the invoice. Before leaving, Voss asked whether we kept old repair orders. I said yes. He asked how long. 7 years. He asked if customer names appeared in our electronic system. I said yes. He asked me to change the customer name on this ticket from Adrian Moss to private account. I refused. I told him our bookkeeping didn't work that way. He didn't argue. He just said, understood. Mercer went out to the sedan. Voss remained at the counter. He lowered his voice. Mr. Pike, did anything about the vehicle cause you concern? I said, other than you asking me 10 times? He almost smiled. Then he said, I'm asking professionally. I told him the missing manufacturer markings were weird. I told him somebody had gone to a lot of effort to remove them. Voss asked if I could identify the method used. I said probably a small grinder or abrasive tool. Recent? I said some looked recent and some didn't. He nodded, then he asked, what about the rear assembly? I stared at him. I said nothing. He repeated it. The rear assembly. I asked what exactly he meant. He said, anything mounted near the axle. I told him there had been a small box there the previous evening. His face changed very slightly. Not shock. More like irritation. I told him it was gone in the morning. He asked who else had seen it. I said everyone in the shop. He asked whether we had handled it. No. Photographed it? I said no. He held my gaze for a few seconds. Then he thanked me. The 2 men drove away in the sedan. Mercer was behind the wheel. Voss followed in another dark car that had been parked near the storage units. After lunch, Mateo came into my office looking nervous. He showed me the picture he'd taken. It was just a normal phone photo of the underside of the car. The rectangular housing was visible near the center. He zoomed in. There was no label on it, but one corner had a small white marking. 3 characters, maybe 7L4, maybe IL4. Hard to tell. I told him to send me the picture. He tried. The message failed. Our shop Wi-Fi had gone down. A minute later, Mateo's phone restarted by itself. When it came back on, the picture was still there. He sent it successfully. I saved it to my office computer and printed a copy. I don't know why. Probably because the whole thing had become strange enough that I wanted a physical record. Around 3, the shop phone rang. A man asked for Green, answered for me. It sounded like Voss. He asked whether any photographs of the vehicle existed. I said, didn't you ask me that already? He said yes. I told him I didn't appreciate the calls. He apologized. Then he said, it would be better if incidental images weren't retained. I asked if that was a threat. He said no, just a request. I said I wasn't discussing it. He thanked me and hung up. That evening, I took the printed photo home. I didn't tell my wife much about it because she already thought the whole situation sounded ridiculous. The next morning, there was a black sedan parked across from the garage when I arrived. Not the same one. This one was newer. Nobody was inside. It stayed there until about 9, then disappeared while we were busy. For the next week, nothing happened. Then Joel noticed a man standing near the storage units behind the shop around lunchtime. Dark pants, white shirt, no jacket. He was facing the garage. When Joel walked toward him, he went between 2 buildings and didn't come back out. There wasn't anywhere obvious for him to go except through the storage property. We called the manager. He hadn't seen anyone. A month later, the repair order for Moss's sedan disappeared from our filing cabinet. The electronic record was still there. The paper copy wasn't. No other invoices were missing. I changed the office locks. I also backed up our security footage and files. After that, the odd visits stopped. I kept the photo Mateo had taken in a folder at home. About a year later, while cleaning out old files, I found it again. The printed image had faded badly, even though it had been stored in the dark. Most of the underside of the car was still visible. The rectangular housing wasn't. That area had gone almost completely gray. The digital copy on my old computer looked normal. I printed it again. I put the new print in an envelope and stored it in a steel filing cabinet in my basement. I sold the garage 4 years later. On my last afternoon there, I cleared out the desk in the office. Behind one of the bottom drawers, I found the original paper repair order for Adrian Moss's sedan. It had been folded twice. Across the back, somebody had written a single line in black ink. No component was removed on site. I put the paper in my jacket pocket, finished locking up the shop, and drove home. I noticed the object because the stars were moving, and it wasn't. I was 23 at the time and finishing my last year at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff. My name was Megan Talbot, and I was studying astronomy with the idea that I'd eventually go into instrumentation or observatory work. This happened during an observing run in early November. It was cold that night, probably in the upper 20s, and the air was extremely dry. There wasn't much wind. The sky was clear enough that the Milky Way looked almost dusty overhead. I was working at a small university observatory outside town with another student named Priya Raman and our lab supervisor, Dr. Caleb Monroe. It wasn't one of the big professional facilities. We had a couple of teaching telescopes, a small control room, and a concrete observation deck surrounded by pine forest. Around 1:30 in the morning, Priya went inside to warm up. Caleb had already gone back to campus because he had an early meeting. That left me alone outside. I was supposed to be recording variable star measurements, which involved a lot of waiting. I had binoculars hanging around my neck, a notebook, and a red flashlight. I first noticed the object low in the western sky above a dark ridge. I thought it was a bright star. Then I looked away for several minutes. When I checked again, the stars around it had shifted slightly because of Earth's rotation. The bright point hadn't. That caught my attention immediately. A fixed object relative to the ground wasn't unusual. Towers had lights. Aircraft could appear stationary if they were moving toward you. Planets moved so slowly against the stars that you wouldn't notice over a few minutes. But this point was sitting in an area where I knew there wasn't a tower. It also didn't behave like a star. I checked it through binoculars. It looked white, no blinking, no red or green navigation lights. I couldn't resolve a shape. I put the binoculars down and used a nearby pine tree as a reference. The object appeared just above one branch. I waited. 5 minutes later, it was still exactly above that branch, while the star field behind it had shifted. I wrote the time in my notebook, 1:43 a.m. Then I wrote stationary white object, WSW, low altitude, unknown. I didn't use the telescope at first because I assumed there was a simple explanation. Maybe a distant light on the ground. Maybe an aircraft seen head-on. I walked about 20 feet across the deck. The object shifted against the tree line. That told me it wasn't attached to the ridge. It was somewhere beyond it or above it. I went inside and called Priya. She came back out carrying a mug. I pointed. She found it immediately. Her first guess was an aircraft. We watched for a couple of minutes. Nothing changed. She asked whether I'd checked flight tracking. I pulled up an app on my phone. There were aircraft around Flagstaff and farther south, but nothing lined up with what we were seeing. The nearest visible aircraft was moving southeast and had obvious blinking lights. Priya went quiet. I asked what she thought. She said, "I don't know." We brought one of the smaller tracking telescopes around manually. It took a few minutes because the object wasn't in our planned target list, and the system wasn't set up for quick random pointing. When we finally centered it, the image wasn't useful. It looked like a bright spot with a faint dark area around it. Atmospheric distortion made the edges ripple. Priya adjusted focus. No improvement. The strange part was the mount. The telescope was tracking the stars. Normally, if you centered a star and let the mount track, it stayed centered. The object drifted because it wasn't moving with the sky, so we stopped the tracking. Then the object stayed almost perfectly centered. That was the moment both of us stopped treating it like a joke. We watched for about 10 minutes. The thing didn't appear to move relative to the ground. The stars passed behind it, not literally visible through it, obviously. I mean, the background star field shifted while the object remained fixed. I wrote down times and approximate positions. Priya took several photos through the eyepiece adapter. Most were bad. The object showed up as an overexposed white spot. At 2:06, it dimmed. Not suddenly. It faded to maybe half its brightness over about 5 seconds. Then it brightened again. Priya said, "Okay, that's weird." A few seconds later, all the lights inside the control room flickered. The telescope mount made a clicking noise, our monitor went black and came back. The power didn't fully fail. I checked the time on my phone, 2:08. The object was still there. Then we heard a vehicle on the access road. That was unusual at that hour. The observatory road was gated lower down, and after midnight, it was usually just authorized staff. We watched headlights move through the trees. They stopped before reaching the building. Priya asked if Caleb had come back. I called him. No answer. The headlights stayed in the same place for maybe 2 minutes. Then they went out. No doors slammed. No footsteps. Nothing. I didn't feel scared yet, mostly annoyed. We had occasionally had people come up trying to stargaze after hours, even though the road was restricted. I took my flashlight and walked toward the edge of the parking area. Priya came with me. We couldn't see a car. The road curved through the trees, so whoever had stopped was hidden from view. I called out. No answer. We waited. Then the headlights came back on. They were farther down the road now. I hadn't heard the vehicle move. That bothered me. Priya said we should go back inside. We did. When we got to the deck, the object had changed position. Not much. It was lower. Maybe half a degree. I checked my notes and the tree branch reference. Definitely lower. It had remained stationary for more than 20 minutes and then moved while we were looking away. I wrote the new position down. At 2:17, it moved again. This time I saw it. The point slid horizontally to the north, slowly. No acceleration that I could detect. No blinking. It moved maybe 1 apparent degree across the sky, then stopped. Priya said, "That isn't a star." I laughed because there wasn't anything else to say. We both started recording on our phones. The videos looked terrible. Black sky, tiny bright dot. Then we heard the clicking noise again. Not from the telescope, from outside the building. 3 clicks. Pause. Then 2. It sounded metallic. Priya looked at me. I asked if she'd heard it. She nodded. We didn't go looking. Around 2:25, the object began dropping toward the ridge. It moved slowly enough that we watched it for several minutes. When it reached the tree line, I expected it to disappear behind the ridge. Instead, it remained visible for another few seconds lower than where the ridge should have blocked it. That suggested either the ridge wasn't where I thought it was, or the object was much closer. Then, it dimmed completely. We waited another 20 minutes. It didn't return. The vehicle on the access road was gone when we checked. The gate was still locked when Priya and I drove out around 4. There were tire tracks in the dirt near a wide spot before the gate. They looked fresh. We didn't stop. The next afternoon, I told Caleb what had happened. He was skeptical, but not dismissive. I showed him my notes. I had recorded times, estimated azimuth and elevation, brightness changes, and the periods when the object moved. He looked at the phone photos. He said they weren't useful. I agreed. He suggested a helicopter, atmospheric reflection, or possibly a balloon with a light. I asked how a balloon could remain fixed relative to the ridge in almost no wind. He said it could have been farther away than we thought. That was possible. We filed a short observational incident note because the power flicker had affected equipment. That should have been the end of it. 2 days later, I got an email from someone claiming to work for a federal contractor. The sender said they were reviewing reports of unusual aerial activity around scientific facilities in northern Arizona and wanted to speak with me. I assumed Caleb had forwarded my report. He said he hadn't. The email listed a phone number and asked when I'd be available. I ignored it. The next day, 2 men came to the astronomy building. I was leaving a lab around 11 in the morning when our department secretary, Denise Harper, called me over. She said, "There are 2 men waiting for you." They stood near the glass doors. Both wore dark suits. One was probably in his 50s, broad face, short gray hair. The other looked maybe 40, taller and very thin, with dark hair and wire-frame glasses. The older man introduced himself as Patrick Lorne. The younger one was Daniel Vey. Lorne showed me a credential. The company name was Strategic Aerospace Assessment Group. It sounded like a consulting firm. There was a government seal on the credential too, but I couldn't tell which department. I asked what agency they worked for. Lorne said they were contractors supporting multiple federal aviation programs. I asked who hired them. He said he couldn't discuss specific clients. That made me want to end the conversation immediately. But they knew about the observation. Lauren asked if we could talk somewhere private. We used an empty conference room. He started with normal questions: time, direction, weather, how many witnesses, what instruments we'd used. I answered most of them. Vay barely spoke. He had a black briefcase on the table. Lauren asked whether I had made handwritten notes. I said yes. He asked if he could see them. I had the notebook in my backpack. I took it out but kept it in front of me. He leaned closer and read the page. Then he asked if he could borrow the notebook. I laughed. He didn't. I said no. He said they could return it in a few days. I said I needed it for my coursework. He offered to give me a receipt. I said no again. Then Vay asked, "Did you make a duplicate?" I said no. He asked whether Priya had copied my notes. No. He asked whether I'd scanned them. No. Lauren said they only needed the pages related to the observation. I asked why. He said they were comparing independent accounts. I offered to make photocopies. He said originals were preferable. That made no sense. I asked what difference the original paper made. He said handwriting pressure, correction marks, and sequence could help establish whether a record had been made in real time. I told him it had. He smiled. "We don't doubt you." Then I said, "So you don't need the original?" He didn't have an answer for that. I closed the notebook. Vay looked annoyed, not angry, just irritated. He asked whether I'd noticed any vehicles near the observatory. I said yes. Lauren looked at him. Vay continued anyway. "What kind?" I said. I had only seen headlights. He asked how long the vehicle had remained. I said maybe 2 minutes. He asked whether I heard doors. No. Voices? No. Engine noise after the headlights went out? No. Then he asked something very specific. Did the lights reappear lower on the access road? I stared at him. That detail wasn't in the incident note Caleb had filed. I hadn't mentioned it in the email because I hadn't responded. I asked how he knew. Vay said, "Another witness." I asked who. He didn't answer. Lauren stepped in and asked about the stationary period again. I said roughly 20 minutes. He corrected me. 23 minutes. I opened the notebook. From my first written entry at 1:43 until the first confirmed movement was close to 23 minutes. I asked how he knew that if he hadn't seen the notebook before. He said he'd estimated from the equipment log. I didn't believe him. The telescope log wouldn't show when I'd first noticed the object with my eyes. I told them I was done. Lauren remained polite. He gave me a business card. Vay closed the briefcase. As they stood, Lauren asked one last time whether I'd reconsider lending them the notebook. I said no. He nodded. "Keep it secure." That wasn't phrased like advice. They left. I watched from the hallway window. They got into a black sedan, parked along the curb. It was a newer Lincoln. No obvious government plate. For the next few days, nothing happened. Then I saw the sedan near the observatory. It was parked in a gravel turnout just outside the access gate. I noticed it around 7 in the evening as Priya and I drove up. There was one person inside. I couldn't tell who. The car didn't follow us. When we left after midnight, it was gone. 3 nights later, it was back. Different position. Same black Lincoln, or one that looked exactly like it. This time it was parked farther down the road near a trailhead. Priya noticed it too. She said, "Your friends are back." I told her I didn't find it funny. We wrote down the plate. Arizona plate. The next day I searched it online through one of those public vehicle lookup sites. Nothing useful. I thought about calling police, but the car wasn't doing anything illegal. It was parked on public land. The following week, I saw it 4 times. Once near the observatory, once in a campus parking garage, once across the street from the coffee shop where I usually studied, once near my apartment. That last one changed how I felt about it. I lived nowhere near the observatory road. I came home around 9:30 and saw the Lincoln parked half a block away. The engine was running. There was a man inside. I kept driving. I circled the block. When I came back, it was still there. I called Priya. She told me to come stay at her place. I drove there. The Lincoln didn't follow. The next morning, it was gone. I called the number on Lauren's business card. A receptionist answered with only strategic assessment. I asked for Patrick Lauren. She put me on hold. Then a man picked up. It sounded like him. I told him to stop having people follow me. There was a pause. He said, "No one from our office is following you." I described the car. He asked for the plate. I gave it to him. Another pause. Then he said, "You should avoid approaching that vehicle." That was when I stopped believing anything he told me. I asked what that meant. He repeated that nobody from his office was following me. I asked if the sedan belonged to them. He hung up. The car kept appearing for another 2 weeks. Never every day. Never for very long. Sometimes nobody seemed to be inside. Other times I could see a man in the driver's seat. I started taking pictures. The photos always looked ordinary. Black Lincoln. Dark windows. Nothing dramatic. One afternoon, I found a note tucked under my windshield wiper on campus. It was blank, except for 4 numbers written in black ink. 143. The time of my first notebook entry. I took the note to campus police. An officer named Sarah Mendoza listened to the whole story. She didn't laugh. She took copies of my photos and wrote a report. She also told me to call immediately if the car followed me or anyone approached me again. For several days after that, I didn't see it. Then, near the end of November, Priya and I had another overnight session at the observatory. The temperature had dropped into the teens. There was snow in shaded areas along the road. The black Lincoln was parked near the gate when we arrived. This time I stopped. Not beside it. About 100 feet away. Priya told me not to get out. I didn't. I took a photo through the windshield. The driver's door opened. Vay stepped out. Same suit. No coat. He stood beside the car and looked toward us. I called campus police. While I was talking to the dispatcher, Vay walked to the rear of the Lincoln. He opened the trunk. For a second, I thought he was going to take something out. Instead, he just stood there looking inside. Then he closed it. He got back in. The Lincoln drove away before officers arrived. I gave them the plate again. The dispatcher later told me the number came back to a fleet registration, but she couldn't give me more information. After that night, the car stopped appearing near campus. I didn't see Lorne or Vay again. I finished the semester. I kept the notebook with me until finals were over. During winter break, I took it home to my parents' house in Tucson. One morning, I opened it to show my father the page. The notes were there exactly as I'd written them. Times, positions, brightness estimates. At the bottom of the page, below my final entry, there was a line I didn't remember writing. It was in black ink instead of the blue pen I'd used that night. It said, 2:25, descent began before observers returned to deck. That was wrong. Priya and I had been standing on the deck when we saw the descent begin. I asked my father if he'd written it. He hadn't. I tore the page out, put it in a plastic sleeve, and stored it separately from the notebook. When spring semester started, I returned to Flagstaff. I drove past the observatory on my first weekend back. The gate was open because there was an afternoon public program. No black car was parked nearby. I stayed until sunset, then drove back into town. Nothing followed me. I kept the original observation page in a locked drawer until I graduated. The last time I checked it before moving out of Arizona, the extra line was still there. The man came into my office a little after 4 in the afternoon without an appointment, soaked through from the rain and carrying one shoe in his hand. I was a family doctor in a small town outside Bemidji, Minnesota. My name was Paul Anders. I was 51 then, and my practice handled the usual rural mix of things. Blood pressure, farm injuries, respiratory infections, kids with fevers, older people who didn't want to drive an hour to a bigger clinic. That day had been slow because the weather was bad. Cold rain had been falling since morning, and by late afternoon there was fog sitting over the fields and low areas along the county roads. My receptionist, Holly Jensen, came to the exam room while I was finishing notes and said there was a walk-in who looked like he'd been in an accident. I went out. The man was sitting in the waiting room by himself. He looked about 35, maybe 40. Thin build, brown hair, jeans, gray work jacket, one muddy boot, one wet sock. The shoe he was carrying was actually the other boot. There was blood on his forehead. Not much. He looked frightened more than injured. I introduced myself and asked what happened. He said something followed my car. That was the first thing he told me. Not that he'd crashed. Not that he'd hit his head. Something followed my car. I asked if he'd been in a collision. He looked toward the front windows. No. I asked his name. He hesitated. Then he said, Evan. I asked for a last name. He looked at Holly, then back at me. Rusk. Holly handed him the intake clipboard. His hand was shaking badly enough that the pen tapped against the plastic. I told him we could handle the paperwork afterward. and brought him into an exam room. His blood pressure was high, around 170 over 100. Pulse was 118. He didn't smell like alcohol. His pupils looked normal. He knew the date, knew where he was, knew who the president was at the time. No obvious confusion. The cut on his forehead was superficial. What concerned me more was his right ankle. It was swollen, and he had trouble putting weight on it. I asked how he'd hurt it. He said he'd jumped over a ditch. I asked why. He said because I thought it was coming across the field. I stopped what I was doing. What was? He rubbed both hands over his face. I don't know. His hands were cold. I gave him a blanket and asked him to start at the beginning. He told me he'd been driving south on County Road 6 after checking a hunting cabin owned by his uncle. That road ran through mostly empty farmland and stretches of woods. There were some houses, but long sections had nothing except fields and drainage ditches. He said it was around 3:15 when he first noticed a light behind him. I asked what kind of light. He said he thought it was a vehicle at first. The fog was thick, and he could only see one bright white light in the mirror. He assumed it was a motorcycle. Then it got closer. He sped up. The light stayed exactly the same distance behind him. He slowed down and stayed there. I asked how he judged the distance in fog. He said he couldn't. But it didn't change, he said. That's the point. I thought he might have had a panic attack while driving. That happened. Something unusual startled a person. Adrenaline took over, then every normal thing seemed wrong. I asked if he was taking any medication or recreational drugs. He shook his head. I asked if he'd slept normally. He said yes. Then he told me the light left the road. I thought I misunderstood. He said he'd reached a straight section where the road ran alongside a harvested cornfield. The light moved to his left, not turned, moved sideways. He could still see it through the driver's window, traveling across the field at about the same speed as his car. I asked if it could have been another vehicle on a parallel road. He said there wasn't one. I knew the area well enough to know he was probably right. He said the light wasn't very high, maybe 20 feet off the ground, maybe lower. He couldn't tell what was behind it. There was no visible body, just a bright circular light that sometimes looked white and sometimes pale yellow through the fog. He said it kept pace with him for almost 2 miles. Then his radio started making a clicking sound. 3 clicks. Pause. 3 clicks. He shut it off. The clicking continued through the speakers. He pulled over. I asked why he'd stop. He looked embarrassed. I thought maybe the car was doing it. He got out with the engine running. The light stopped too. It hovered over the field. He said he stood there for maybe 10 seconds looking at it. Then he heard something moving in the ditch behind him, not running, walking. He couldn't see anything because the ditch was full of tall dead grass. He got back into the car. The driver's door wouldn't close. I asked what he meant. He said the latch wouldn't catch. He slammed it twice. Nothing. Then he saw something in the rearview mirror. He couldn't describe it well. He said there was a darker shape behind the car, standing near the road, human-sized, maybe taller. He couldn't see arms or a face, just a narrow, dark shape in the fog. That was when he left the car. I asked if he'd abandoned it. He nodded. He ran across the road, jumped the ditch, landed badly on his ankle, and headed toward a farmhouse he could see through the trees. Nobody was home. He stayed on the porch for several minutes. The light was gone by then, so was the shape. Eventually, a delivery driver came down the road. Evan flagged him down and got a ride into town. The driver dropped him near my clinic because it was the first medical place they passed. I asked where his car was. He gave me a rough location. I asked if he'd called the sheriff. No. Why not? He looked genuinely confused by the question. I came here. I told him he should report an abandoned vehicle at minimum. He stared toward the exam room door. Then he asked if we had a back exit. I asked why. There's a black car outside. I went to the window. Our parking lot wasn't large. There were 6 or 7 vehicles. Holly's Subaru, my pickup, 2 patient cars, and a dark sedan parked near the road. I hadn't noticed it before. It was a large black car with tinted rear windows. Could have been a Chrysler. Could have been a Ford. Nobody was standing around it. I told Evan it was probably another patient's vehicle. He shook his head. No, that was behind the delivery van. I asked if he was certain. He said he'd seen it twice on the way into town. Once at a stop sign, once near a gas station. I went back to examining his ankle. There wasn't much I could do without imaging. Our clinic had an old x-ray unit, but the technician had already gone home. I wrapped the ankle, gave him an ice pack, and told him he needed an x-ray either at urgent care in Bemidji or the hospital. He barely listened. He kept looking toward the window. At 4:35, Holly knocked. She said the black sedan had left. Evan visibly relaxed. I gave him some water. Then I asked for his driver's license so Holly could finish registration. He reached into his jacket. He pulled out a wallet, a set of keys, a folded receipt, and a small folding knife. He set everything on the counter. Then he checked his pockets again. No phone. He said he'd left it in the car. I asked if Holly could call someone for him. He gave us a number. She tried. No answer. I asked if it was his wife. He said sister. I asked where he lived. He said near Cass Lake. Then he suddenly stopped talking. He was looking past me toward the hallway. I turned. Nobody was there. What? He said, did you hear that? I hadn't. He said there had been a tapping sound. I listened. Nothing. Then I heard it. 3 soft taps. They seemed to come from somewhere outside the wall. Tap, tap, tap. There was a pause. Then 3 more. The exam room was on the north side of the building. Outside that wall was a narrow strip of grass, and then the parking lot. I stepped into the hall and checked another window. Nothing. When I returned, Evan was standing. I told him to sit because of his ankle. He said he needed to leave. I told him we could arrange a ride to the hospital. No hospital. I asked what he planned to do. He said he'd walk to his sister's friend's house. I told him that was a terrible idea with his ankle. He didn't seem to care. Then the clinic phone rang. Holly answered. A few seconds later, she called my name. I went out front. She had the receiver pressed against her chest. She whispered that the caller was asking for Evan. I asked who it was. She shook her head. They won't say. I took the phone. I said, this is Dr. Anders. A man asked, is Mr. Rusk still present? His voice was calm and formal. I asked who was calling. There was a short pause. Is he still in the building? I said I couldn't confirm whether a patient was there. The man said, understood. Then he hung up. I stood there holding the receiver. Holly asked what that was about. I didn't know. I went back to the exam room. Evan was gone. At first I thought he'd gone to the bathroom. Then I saw the door at the end of the hall slowly closing. The back exit. I went outside. Rain was still falling. I could see him moving across the alley behind the clinic, limping badly. I called his name. He turned once, then he kept going. I considered following him, but I had 2 other patients waiting and no reason to physically stop an adult from leaving. He had left everything on the counter. Wallet, keys, knife, receipt, even his wet boot. I put the items into a large specimen bag and wrote his name on it. I called the sheriff's office, not because of the light story, because he had left injured without identification, and I was worried he wasn't thinking clearly. A deputy named Kara Wilmot came by around 5:30. I gave her the location where Evan said he left his vehicle. She took his information from the driver's license. His full name was Evan Michael Rusk. The address matched what he'd told me. Kara said she'd checked the road. She asked if I thought he was mentally unstable. I said he had been frightened and anxious, but oriented. I didn't think he was psychotic. I told her the story about the light because it seemed relevant. She gave me a look, but wrote it down. She took the knife because she said she'd return it with his other belongings if she found him. I kept the wallet and keys locked in my desk. The clinic closed at 6. Holly left first. I stayed to finish charts. By then the rain had mostly stopped. It was getting dark. Around 6:40, headlights swept across the front windows. A black sedan pulled into the lot. I assumed Kara had returned with someone. 2 men got out, both wore dark suits. The older one was broad-shouldered, maybe in his 50s, with gray hair cut very close. The other was younger and tall, with dark hair and a narrow face. They entered without knocking. The older man said, Dr. Anders? I said yes. He introduced himself as Mr. Shaw. The younger man was Mr. Bell. No first names. Shaw showed me identification in a leather case. I looked at it longer than he probably wanted me to. The words said Interstate Transportation Safety Bureau. There was a seal, photograph, identification number. I had never heard of that bureau. I asked if they were with the Department of Transportation. Shaw said, we work in coordination with them. I asked why they were there. He said they were following up on a disabled vehicle reported on County Road 6. That seemed plausible. Then he said, "We understand the driver was treated here." I asked who told them. Shaw ignored the question. Bell stood near the waiting room chairs looking around. Shaw asked if Evan Rusk was still present. I said no. He asked when he'd left. I said sometime after 5. That wasn't exactly true, but I wanted to see if he'd correct me. He did. 4:48? I looked at him. I asked where he got that time. He said they had been reconstructing the driver's movements. I hadn't told the sheriff exactly when Evan left because I hadn't checked the clock when I saw him go. Shaw asked whether Evan had left any personal property. I said yes. He said they'd take possession of it. I asked why, to return it. I told him the sheriff's department was already handling that. Bell looked at Shaw. Shaw said, "We're aware." That bothered me. Kara had left less than an hour earlier. I hadn't called anyone else. I asked if they had spoken with her. Shaw said, "Our office has been notified." Again, vague. I asked for a contact number. He handed me a business card. It had his name, the bureau name, and a Washington number. I set it on the counter. Shaw asked what Evan had brought in. I said a wallet and keys. His eyes went briefly toward my office. "Anything else?" I said no. Bell spoke for the first time. "A receipt?" I didn't answer. He asked again. "Did he leave a receipt?" I felt my stomach tighten. The folded receipt had been mixed in with his wallet and keys. I hadn't mentioned it to Kara. I hadn't even looked at it closely. I asked why a receipt mattered. Bell said it may establish his route. Shaw gave him a quick glance. I said I wouldn't release patient belongings without confirming who they were. Shaw nodded politely. "That's reasonable." He didn't argue. Then he asked if he could see the exam room Evan had used. I said no. He asked whether Evan had described what caused the accident. I said there hadn't been an accident. Shaw tilted his head slightly. "What caused the ankle injury?" I told him. Evan said he'd jumped a ditch. Shaw asked why. I said he'd been frightened. "By what?" I hesitated. Then I said, he thought something was following his car. Neither man looked surprised. Bell asked, "Did he call it a light?" I stared at him. I had never contacted them. I had never told them anything about a light. I said, "How do you know what he called it?" Shaw stepped in. "The vehicle was located with its lights on." That didn't answer the question. Bell asked whether Evan had described the light changing position. I said this was starting to feel less like a transportation investigation. Shaw smiled slightly. He asked, "Did Mr. Rusk report sounds from inside the vehicle?" I thought about the clicking. I said no. Bell looked directly at me. "Nothing rhythmic?" I didn't answer. Shaw changed direction. He asked whether Evan's clothing had anything unusual on it. Mud, residue, burn marks. I said no. He asked if I'd taken blood. No. Urine sample? No. Any imaging? No. He seemed relieved by that last answer. Then Bell asked whether Evan had been wearing both shoes when he arrived. I said he had one on and carried one. "Which foot?" I told him. Bell wrote it down in a small notebook. Shaw asked again for the belongings. I refused again. He stayed polite. "Then perhaps we could examine them here." I said no. There was a silence. Rainwater from their shoes had made small dark spots on the floor. That was when I noticed something odd. Their car wasn't visible through the front window anymore. I stepped sideways to get a better angle. The parking space where they'd left it was empty. I hadn't heard an engine. I hadn't seen headlights. I asked where their car went. Bell glanced outside. Shaw said, "Our associate moved it." There had only been 2 men when they arrived. At least I had only seen 2. I walked toward the door. A black sedan was now parked on the street half a block away. Maybe someone really had moved it. I couldn't see anybody inside. When I turned around, Bell was standing close to the doorway of my office. I told him not to go in there. He stepped back immediately. "Of course." Shaw asked if Evan had said anything about a farmhouse. I said no. That question came completely out of nowhere. He didn't answer. Then he asked about animals. Had Evan mentioned deer, dogs, livestock? I said no. Bell looked disappointed. Shaw thanked me for my time. Before leaving, he said someone would contact me about the belongings. I asked who. The appropriate office. I told him that wasn't happening unless law enforcement confirmed it. He gave me another small smile. That should be fine. They walked out. I locked the door behind them. I watched from inside. They went toward the sedan down the street. Neither looked back. I called Kara. She answered from her patrol car. I told her about the men. She hadn't contacted any transportation agency. Neither had her office. Then she told me something else. They had found Evan's car. It was exactly where he'd described it. Driver's door open, engine off, keys missing, obviously, because I had them. No signs of a crash, no damage except mud on the driver's side. She had driven along the ditch looking for where he'd crossed. She found footprints. They went from the car across the road and into the field. Then they came back. I asked what she meant. She said there were two sets of tracks that appeared to belong to the same person. One headed toward the farmhouse, one headed back toward the car. But Evan had told me he'd never gone back. Kara said she'd found another set near the edge of the road. Hard to make out because of rain. Larger shoe prints. They didn't lead anywhere obvious. They began near the ditch and ended about 20 feet later on pavement. I asked if they'd found Evan. Not yet. She had spoken to his sister. Evan had called her from a gas station about half an hour earlier. He was safe. A friend was driving him home. That was a relief. Kara said she'd bring his belongings to him the next morning. I told her I'd drop everything at the sheriff's office instead. Before I left the clinic, I took the folded receipt out of the specimen bag. It was from a small gas station north of town. Time-stamped 3:02 p.m., 1 bottle of water, 1 coffee. The back had something written on it in pencil. 3 numbers, 636. I couldn't tell what they meant. I put it back without making a copy. Then I noticed Shaw's business card on the counter. I called the number. A recorded message said the number could not be completed as dialed. I tried twice. Same thing. I looked up the Interstate Transportation Safety Bureau on my office computer. Nothing. The closest real name I found belonged to a completely different federal agency. I put Evan's belongings in my bag and drove them directly to the sheriff's office. Kara met me at the desk. I handed everything over. She looked at Shaw's business card. She took a picture of it. Then she called the state transportation office while I stood there. Nobody she spoke with recognized the bureau name. I drove home around 8:30. The fog had come back. I took the main highway instead of the county roads. About 5 miles from my house, a black sedan appeared behind me. It stayed there through 2 turns. I told myself there were thousands of black sedans in Minnesota. At the next intersection, I slowed. It slowed. I turned into a brightly lit grocery store parking lot. The sedan continued past. I sat there for 10 minutes before leaving. When I got home, my wife, Sharon, was already in bed reading. I checked the driveway, locked the doors, and finally told her the whole story. The next morning, Kara called. Evan was home. His ankle was fractured, and his sister had taken him to the hospital. He remembered leaving my clinic and remembered calling her from the gas station. He didn't remember how he'd gotten from behind my building to the gas station almost 2 miles away. He thought somebody had given him a ride. He couldn't remember the driver. Kara returned his wallet and keys. The receipt wasn't in the bag. She called me back to ask if I'd kept it. I hadn't. We both remembered seeing it. Neither of us knew where it went. I went to work. The clinic looked normal. No black sedan outside, no men waiting. Around noon, Holly called me to the front desk. A plain white envelope had been pushed through the mail slot. No stamp. No name. Inside was the missing gas station receipt. Nothing else. The pencil numbers on the back were gone. I put it in an envelope of my own, drove it to the sheriff's office after work, and handed it directly to Kara. Then I went home using the highway. I saw the 3 lights come down over the far side of the reservoir a little before midnight. I had been fishing alone for crappie near the old flooded timber at Lake Eufaula in eastern Oklahoma. My name was Wesley Grant. I was 47 then, and I had been fishing that lake since I was a teenager. It was late May, warm even after dark, with almost no wind. There had been storms earlier in the afternoon, but by 10 the sky had mostly cleared. A few clouds still sat low on the horizon, and every so often I could see distant lightning far to the west without hearing thunder. I had launched around 7 from a small public ramp on the north end. There were several other trailers in the lot when I arrived, but most people had gone home by 10. I liked fishing late because the boat traffic died down and the water got quiet. Around 11:30, I was anchored near a line of dead trees sticking up from the water. The opposite shore was maybe a mile away. There wasn't much over there except woods and some private land farther inland. I noticed the first light because I thought it was a plane coming toward me. It was white and steady. Then a second appeared to the left of it. Then a third. They formed a loose triangle. I watched for blinking navigation lights. There weren't any. The lights moved very slowly, not toward me. Down. At first I thought I was seeing aircraft descending behind the horizon, maybe lining up for some small airstrip I didn't know about. But they stayed together. Same spacing, same speed. They dropped almost straight toward the tree line. I set my fishing rod down. The lake was flat enough that the lights reflected faintly on the water. 3 short, white streaks. That made me realize they were brighter than I'd thought. I checked my phone. 11:43. I remember the time because I considered taking a video and looked at the screen. I tried. The phone camera showed almost nothing, just darkness and a couple of tiny dots. I stopped recording after maybe 15 seconds. The lights kept descending. When they got close to the trees, the middle one turned pale orange. The other 2 stayed white. Then all 3 stopped. They hung there above the far shore. I couldn't judge height. Maybe a few hundred feet. Maybe lower. There was no sound. That was what made me start feeling uncomfortable. Sound carried well over the water at night. I could hear a truck on a highway somewhere behind me. I could hear frogs along the shoreline. I could hear my trolling motor battery making a faint electrical hum. If those had been helicopters, I should have heard something. I picked up my binoculars. They weren't expensive, just a pair I kept in the boat for looking at shoreline markers. Through them, the lights didn't look much different. They were too bright to see anything around them. I moved the binoculars down toward the trees. That's when I noticed something on the shoreline. A light was moving through the woods, not one of the 3. This was smaller and lower, almost like somebody carrying a flashlight. It moved between the trees from right to left. I thought maybe people were camping over there. Then the moving light went out. A few seconds later, the 3 larger lights started dropping again, one at a time. The left one went down first. It disappeared behind the trees, then the right, then the orange one in the middle. After that, everything on the far shore went dark. I waited. Nothing happened. I tried to convince myself I'd watched 3 small planes go behind a ridge. There was a problem with that. There wasn't a ridge there. The land on that side was low. I knew it because I'd fished all around the reservoir. I sat there for about 5 minutes. Then I heard something out on the water. A low splashing sound. Not close. Maybe 200 yards away. It came from the direction of the far shore. I shined my spotlight across the water. The beam didn't reach far enough. I saw nothing. The splashing stopped. Then I heard a single knock against the side of my boat. I looked down. Nothing was there. Sometimes fish bumped the hull, so I wasn't worried yet. A minute later, there were 2 more knocks, both on the left side. The boat shifted slightly. I pulled up the anchor. I decided I was done fishing. As soon as I started the outboard, the depth finder went blank. The screen stayed lit, but all the numbers disappeared. I tapped it. Nothing. Then the display filled with vertical lines. The motor sounded normal. I put the boat in gear and headed toward the ramp. About halfway back, the depth finder started working again. I checked the time, 12:02. That didn't seem right. I had started pulling anchor only a few minutes after the lights disappeared, and the run back should have taken around 10 minutes. I must have spent more time sitting there than I realized. The ramp was empty when I arrived. All the other trailers were gone. I loaded the boat by myself. While I was tightening the rear straps, I noticed headlights parked at the far edge of the lot. A dark car was sitting under some trees. Its parking lights were on. I couldn't see anyone inside, and couldn't see anyone inside. I assumed somebody was waiting for a fisherman. I finished securing the boat. When I pulled out of the lot, the car stayed there. I got home around 1. My wife, Linda, was asleep. I put the fish in the garage refrigerator and went inside. The next morning, I watched the short video I'd taken. It showed 2 of the lights. The third was out of frame. Mostly, it looked like 2 white points against a black sky. There was one thing I hadn't noticed while recording. Near the end, a faint clicking sound appeared on the audio. 3 clicks. A pause. Then 3 more. I listened several times. It could have been something in the boat. I deleted the video a few days later because it didn't show much. Nothing else happened that week. The following Saturday, I went back. Same ramp, same general plan. I arrived earlier, around 6:30 in the evening. There were families loading boats, kids swimming near the shore, people carrying coolers. Everything felt completely normal. I parked the truck, launched, and fished until after dark. I kept looking toward the far shore. No strange lights. Around 10:30, I decided to head in. There were still 2 trailers besides mine in the lot. As I idled toward the ramp, I noticed a black sedan parked near the picnic area. It was a large car, older looking, with dark windows. 2 men stood beside it. Both wore dark clothes. At first, I thought they were game wardens. They watched me load the boat. I backed the trailer down, winched the boat up, then pulled into the parking area to strap everything down. The 2 men started walking toward me. That immediately seemed odd. They were dressed in suits, full suits, dark jackets, white shirts, ties. It was close to 80 degrees and humid. The older man smiled as they approached. "Evening." I said hello. He was maybe 55, with short gray hair and a narrow face. The younger one looked late 30s or early 40s. Dark hair, pale skin, taller than the other man. The older man asked if I fished there often. I said sometimes. He asked what I usually caught. Crappie and catfish. He asked whether I normally stayed out after dark. I said yes. Then he asked, "What time do you generally leave the water?" That was the first question that bothered me. Not what time the ramp closed. Not whether I'd had any trouble. "What time do you generally leave the water?" I said it depended. He nodded. "Midnight?" I said sometimes. "Later?" "Not usually." The younger man hadn't spoken. He stood slightly behind the older one, looking at my boat. Not the fishing gear, the floor and the side of the hull. The older man said they were conducting a recreational use survey. I asked who for. He reached into his jacket and showed me an identification wallet. The words on it said Regional Water Resource Assessment. There was some kind of seal. His name was Harold Venn. The younger man introduced himself as Clark Mercer. I asked if they worked for the Corps of Engineers. Venn said, "We coordinate with them." That sounded official enough, but I'd dealt with Corps personnel before. They wore uniforms or work clothes. They didn't stand at boat ramps at night in black suits. Venn asked whether I usually fished alone. I said mostly. He asked which part of the reservoir I preferred. I pointed generally south. He asked if I ever crossed to the eastern shore. I said sometimes. Mercer finally spoke. "How close do you go?" I looked at him. "To what?" "The eastern shore." I said close enough to fish it. He nodded. Venn asked whether I'd had any problems with navigation lights or boat electronics recently. That caught me. I said, "Why?" He smiled. "We're collecting reports about electrical interference near the water." I hadn't mentioned the depth finder. I said it had acted strange the previous weekend. Mercer looked up immediately. "What time?" I said I didn't remember. He asked whether it happened before or after I returned to the ramp. I said before. Venn asked whether the outboard had stalled. No. Radio issues? I didn't have a marine radio. Phone? I said no. Then Mercer asked, "Did you observe any lights on the eastern side?" I stared at him. They hadn't mentioned lights until then. I had assumed that was why they were talking to me, but neither had actually said anything about them. I told him yes. Venn looked at Mercer. Not angry, just quick. Then Venn asked casually, "What kind of lights?" I described the 3 points coming down over the trees. He asked if they were all the same color. I said 2 were white and 1 turned orange. Mercer asked, "Before or after they stopped?" I looked at him. I hadn't said they'd stopped. I said, "How do you know they stopped?" Neither answered immediately. Venn said, "You said they descended slowly." "That's not the same thing." He nodded. "Fair enough." Mercer looked toward the water. Venn asked how long I'd watched them. I said maybe 10 minutes. He asked where my boat had been. I pointed roughly toward the flooded timber. He said, "Near the standing deadwood." Again, more specific than I'd been. I asked if somebody else had reported the same thing. Venn said there had been several calls about unusual lights in the area. I asked from who. He said he couldn't discuss other reports. I asked why 2 government contractors were interviewing fishermen at 10:30 on a Saturday night. Venn smiled. "Because that's when fishermen are here." That was actually a good answer. Still, something about them felt wrong. Mercer walked around the back of my boat. He looked at the transducer for the depth finder. He didn't touch it. Then he asked, "Did you hear contact against the hull?" My mouth went dry. I said, "What do you mean?" "Impact, debris, fish." I said, "Fish sometimes bump boats." Repeatedly? I didn't answer. Ben stepped closer. "Mr. Grant, we're not suggesting anything unusual occurred." I hadn't given them my name. I looked at him. "How do you know my name?" He glanced toward my truck. My registration sticker wasn't readable from where he stood. "My mistake," he said. "We have a list of local permit holders. There was no special fishing permit tied to that ramp. Just a state license." I said I wanted to see their identification again. Ben showed his. I asked to take a photo. He closed it. "We don't allow reproduction of credentials." Mercer returned to his side. Ben asked if I had photographed the lights. I said no. That was partly true. I'd deleted the video. He asked whether anyone else saw them. I said not that I knew. He asked whether I'd told anyone. I said my wife. I hadn't, actually. I'd only told her the depth finder acted up. I wanted to see his reaction. He just nodded. Mercer asked, "Did she watch the recording?" I felt a tightening in my chest. I hadn't told them there had been a recording. I said, "What recording?" He stared at me. Ben said, "If you had made one." I said I hadn't. Mercer kept looking at me for another second. Then he looked away. Ben thanked me for answering their questions. I asked for a business card. He reached inside his jacket, then said he didn't have one available. I almost laughed. 2 government contractors conducting a survey with no clipboards, no forms, no visible equipment, and no business cards. I asked where their survey vehicle was registered. Ben looked confused. I pointed to the black sedan. He said, "Oklahoma." There was no rear plate. I could see that clearly now. The mounting bracket was empty. I said, "You're missing a tag." Both men looked at the car. Mercer said, "Temporary transport." I finished securing my boat. Ben asked one last question. "Last Saturday, what time did you leave this parking lot?" I said, I didn't know exactly. Mercer said, 12:18. I stopped pulling on the strap. I said, "What?" He repeated it. "Approximately 12:18. I asked how they could possibly know that. Ben said there were traffic monitors near the access road. I knew that road. There were no cameras, no toll equipment, no gate system. I said so. Ben gave the smallest shrug. Other sources. I got into my truck. The men walked back toward the sedan. I waited for them to leave first. They didn't. They stood beside the car and watched me. So I pulled out. The sedan stayed in the lot. For the first few miles, nobody followed me. Then I saw headlights in my mirror. A dark car. It stayed maybe a quarter mile back. I made a turn I wouldn't normally take, heading toward a convenience store. The car turned too. I pulled into the brightly lit lot. The other car continued past. I couldn't tell if it was the same sedan. I stayed there for 15 minutes. When I finally left, the road was empty. I got home around midnight. Linda was watching television. I told her 2 strange men had questioned me at the ramp. She asked if they were game wardens. I said no. Then I asked whether anybody had called the house during the week, asking about me. She thought about it. She said a man had called Thursday afternoon asking what days I normally went fishing. She assumed it was somebody from my fishing club. I wasn't in a fishing club. I asked what the man said his name was. She couldn't remember. The next morning, I called the Corps office that managed facilities around the lake. I described the men and the agency name. The woman I spoke with said she hadn't heard of the Regional Water Resource Assessment Office. She checked with someone else. Same answer. I called the county sheriff's office. They hadn't had anyone doing surveys at the ramp. I told them about the missing license plate. A deputy said he'd drive through. By then, of course, the sedan was gone. I stayed away from that ramp for 3 weeks. Then curiosity got the better of me. I went back on a Sunday afternoon. Bright sun. Plenty of people around. I didn't take the boat. I just drove down. Nothing strange was parked there. I walked to the end of the dock and looked across the reservoir. The far shore looked ordinary. Trees. Water. Water. A few fishing boats. Then I noticed a black sedan on the access road behind me. It rolled slowly through the lot, same general shape. I couldn't see the plate. It didn't stop. It continued back toward the highway. I drove home before dark. That summer, I started launching from a different ramp, farther south. I never saw the 3 lights again. I did see the black sedan one more time. It was in October, early evening, parked across from a diner where Linda and I had stopped after visiting friends. We came out around 8. The car sat under a streetlight. Two men were inside. I couldn't tell if they were Venn and Mercer. As I unlocked my truck, the sedan's headlights came on. It pulled away slowly. Linda asked why I was staring at it. I told her it looked familiar. We drove home using the main highway. The trouble ticket came through at 7:10 on a cold Monday morning, and by 8, I was standing beside a telephone pedestal on a gravel road listening to a sound that shouldn't have been on the line. My name was Calvin Reese. I was 46 at the time, and I worked outside plant maintenance for a regional telephone company in southern Indiana. This was back when a lot of rural customers still had copper landlines, so most of my work involved old buried cable, bad splices, water in junction boxes, and people complaining about static. The complaint that morning came from 3 separate customers along County Road 700 East. All of them reported the same thing. Their phones had started ringing once every few minutes during the night, but when they answered, nobody was there. One customer also said she could hear another telephone ringing faintly in the background. That wasn't especially strange by itself. Crossed lines happened. Bad cable could do weird things when moisture got into it. It had rained hard all weekend, then the temperature dropped overnight. There was frost in the ditches and a low gray sky that looked like it might snow. I started at the main pedestal near the highway. The line tested badly. There was enough resistance to suggest water somewhere, but there was also a repeating pulse I couldn't explain. Every 43 seconds, almost exactly, I heard a short burst through my test set. 3 clicks, then a faint tone, then nothing. I timed it 4 times, 43 seconds, 43, 44, 43. I called dispatch and asked whether anybody was running automated testing on that cable pair. The dispatcher, Brenda Miles, checked and said no. I moved farther down the road. The next pedestal tested clean. That narrowed the problem to a branch serving 4 properties. 3 were occupied. The 4th was an old farmhouse at the end of Danner Lane. I knew the place. Everyone who worked that district knew it because the service records were a mess. The farmhouse had belonged to a man named Earl Danner, who died several years earlier. His daughter lived in Indianapolis and had apparently been trying to sell the property. The phone service had been disconnected at least 2 years before. There shouldn't have been any active line there, but when I isolated the branch leading toward Danner Farm, the interference stopped. I reconnected it. 3 clicks, then the tone. I disconnected it again. Silence. That was enough for me. I drove down Danner Lane. It was barely a road, more like a long gravel driveway running between soybean fields. The fields had been harvested, so there wasn't anything out there except brown stubble, tree lines, and utility poles. The farmhouse sat about 3/4 of a mile off the county road. 2 stories. White siding gone yellow in places, dark green roof, big porch across the front. There was a barn behind it and a machine shed farther back. I expected the place to look abandoned. It didn't. There was a black sedan parked beside the house. That was the first thing that caught my attention. It was clean enough that it looked recently washed, which seemed unlikely considering the driveway was wet gravel. No pickup, no moving truck, no contractor van, just the sedan. I parked my company truck near the utility pole at the edge of the yard. The pole had an old drop running toward the house. According to my records, that drop was supposed to be dead. I connected my test set. There was voltage on it. Low, but definitely there. Then I heard ringing, not through the air, through the line, a normal telephone ring signal. I checked my paperwork again because I thought maybe the account had been reactivated without the plant records updating. The service number still showed disconnected. No active customer. No pending installation. I called Brenda. She checked billing. Nothing. I asked her to verify the address. She did. Vacant property, she said. I looked at the sedan. I said, doesn't look vacant. She told me to knock and find out who was there. I walked up the driveway. The yard looked strange for an empty farmhouse. The grass was tall in places, but there were fresh tire tracks near the porch. A section of weeds beside the foundation had been flattened. One downstairs window had a curtain. The others were bare. I stepped onto the porch. Before I knocked, I heard something inside. A chair scraping across a floor. Then silence. I knocked. Nobody answered. I knocked again. This time the door opened almost immediately. A man stood there wearing a dark suit. He looked about 50. Gray hair, neatly parted, pale face, white shirt, dark tie. I remember looking down at his shoes because they were polished and completely dry. The porch boards were damp. I introduced myself and showed him my company badge. I said we were tracing a telephone fault, and the problem appeared to be coming from the property. The man looked at my badge longer than necessary. Then he said, "There is no telephone here." His voice was calm, not defensive. I said the line entering the house was active. He said, "That isn't possible." I told him I had just tested it. He looked over his shoulder. A second man appeared in the hallway behind him. Younger, maybe late 30s. Dark hair, same kind of suit. He didn't come to the door, he just stood there watching. I asked if they were renting the property. The older man said they had permission to be there. I asked from the owner. He said yes. I told him I wasn't interested in why they were there. I just needed access to the telephone protector, which was probably mounted in the basement or on the side of the house. He said, "There is no telephone inside." I said I understood that, but there was still a line. The younger man moved closer. He asked, "What exactly are you receiving?" That struck me as an odd way to phrase it. I said, "Interference." "What kind?" I told him, "Clicking and false ringing." The older man looked at him. The younger man asked, "At regular intervals?" I didn't answer right away. I asked if they had equipment running inside. He said no. Computers? No. Alarm system? No. Fax line? No. I said something in the house was putting voltage back onto our cable. The older man said, "You don't need to enter." I told him I could disconnect the drop outside if necessary. He asked whether that would affect neighboring customers. I said no. He nodded. "Then do that." I asked his name for the service record. He hesitated just slightly. "Howard Crane." I looked at the younger man. He said, "Lewis." I asked whether that was his first or last name. He says, "I wrote both down." Crane watched me do it. "Will the record be retained?" I laughed because I thought he was joking. I said maintenance records were kept automatically. He didn't smile. I asked again if they were sure there wasn't a telephone inside. Crane said, "Absolutely." I stepped off the porch. As I walked back toward the truck, I heard a telephone ringing inside the farmhouse. Not through my test set, an actual phone. A loud old-fashioned ring. 2 short bursts. Pause. 2 bursts. I stopped. The sound was coming from somewhere on the first floor. I turned around. Crane was still standing in the doorway. He had heard it. There was no question about that. The younger man was behind him. Nobody moved. The phone rang again. Crane slowly closed the door. I stood in the yard for several seconds looking at the house. Then I went back to the pole. My first thought was that they were lying because they didn't want a utility worker inside. That wasn't illegal. People lied to us all the time. Maybe they had some unregistered equipment hooked to an old phone jack. Maybe they were using the place as an office and hadn't bothered opening an account properly. I disconnected the drop. The moment I did, the ringing inside stopped. I checked the neighboring lines. The interference was gone. Problem solved, at least technically. I called Brenda and told her I'd isolated an unauthorized connection at the vacant property. She asked if I needed a supervisor. I said not yet. Then she said something that made me look back at the house. She said the old Danner line had been physically disconnected at the central office, not just suspended. There shouldn't have been a dial tone or ring voltage reaching that house from our network. I asked if she was sure. She was. I went back to my truck and got a meter. The disconnected drop from the farmhouse still showed voltage. That meant the voltage was coming from the house. I tested it again. Then I got the same 3 clicks through a wire I had physically separated from our system. Click, click, click. Then the faint tone. I stared at the meter. The voltage dropped to 0, then came back. I thought about knocking again. I decided not to. There wasn't any immediate danger, and I didn't know what equipment they had inside. I finished the ticket as customer side foreign voltage disconnected at demarcation. Before leaving, I took a photograph of the pole connection for the work record. The black sedan was visible in the background. As I lowered the phone, I noticed one of the men standing at an upstairs window. The younger one, Lewis. He was watching me. I drove away. At the end of Danner Lane, I stopped and checked my mirrors. The sedan hadn't moved. I went on to my next job. Around 11, Brenda called. She asked why I'd closed the Danner ticket. I explained. She said there was no Danner ticket in the system. I told her I'd been working it all morning. She said the original trouble report only showed the 3 occupied customers. Nothing about the vacant farmhouse. I asked her to search my completed work. She did. No record of me going there. I pulled over and checked my tablet. The ticket was gone. My notes were gone too. The photos I'd taken at the pole were still on my phone, so I knew I hadn't imagined the stop. I sent one to Brenda. She called me a minute later. "Who owns the black car?" I said I didn't know. She asked if I'd called my supervisor. I said not yet. She told me to. My supervisor, Ron Felder, wasn't especially interested. He said software errors happened and told me to recreate the notes when I got back to the office. I did. That afternoon, I looked up the Danner property service history. The line had been disconnected 27 months earlier. There had been no work orders since. The strange part was the last service note. It said the drop had been removed from the house, not disconnected, removed. I knew what that meant. A technician had supposedly taken the physical wire down. The wire I tested that morning shouldn't have existed. I called the technician whose ID was on the old ticket. His name was Mark Hensley. He still worked for the company. I asked if he remembered Danner Farm. He did. He said he'd removed the drop because a tree had pulled it loose and the property owner didn't want service restored. I asked whether he was sure. He said he'd physically coiled the wire and thrown it in his truck. I didn't tell him what I'd found. I asked if he'd ever gone back. No. Around 5, I left work. The sky had cleared a little, but it was already getting dark. When I pulled onto the highway, I noticed a black sedan behind me. I couldn't tell if it was the same one. It stayed 3 or 4 cars back. I turned toward town. It turned 2. I stopped at a gas station. The sedan kept going. I bought coffee and stood inside longer than necessary. When I finally left, it was gone. The next morning, Ron called me into his office. 2 men were waiting. Dark suits, Crane and Lewis. Neither acted like we'd met. Ron introduced them as representatives from a contractor called Midstate Infrastructure Review. Crane shook my hand. "Mr. Reese." I looked at him. I said, "We met yesterday." He smiled politely. "Briefly." Ron said they were following up on possible unauthorized utility access at the Danner property. I asked who had contacted them. Ron said corporate security. That didn't make sense because I hadn't filed anything with security. Crane asked whether we could talk privately. Ron stayed. Ron stayed. That seemed to annoy Lewis. Crane asked me to describe exactly what I'd found. I told him the line had foreign voltage. He asked how much. I gave him the approximate reading. He asked whether I had measured frequency. I said no. He asked whether I recorded the clicking. No. He asked if the ringing signal resembled standard North American cadence. That was such a technical question that I looked at him differently. I asked if he had telecom experience. Some. Lewis asked whether I'd heard the telephone inside the house after disconnecting the line. I said, "You were there." He ignored that. Crane looked at me. "Did you hear it after the disconnect?" I thought back. The phone had stopped almost immediately when I disconnected the wire. I said no. He asked if I was certain. I said yes. Lewis wrote something down. Then Crane asked whether I'd photographed the property. I said yes. He asked to see the images. I showed him the pole photo. He studied it for a few seconds. Then he asked me to zoom in on the upstairs window. Lewis leaned over. I could barely make out his own figure in the window. He said, "Delete that." I laughed. "What?" Crane said more politely, "We'd prefer you remove photographs showing personnel." I said it was a company work photo taken from a public utility easement. Crane nodded. "Of course." He didn't press it. Then Lewis asked what time I heard the first ring inside. I said I hadn't checked exactly. He said 8:47? I looked at him. I had arrived at the property shortly before 8:30. 8:47 sounded about right. I asked how he knew. He said, "Your dispatch timeline." There was no dispatch timeline for the Danner stop. The ticket had disappeared. I said that. Neither man responded. Ron looked uncomfortable now. Crane changed the subject. He asked whether I'd noticed any other vehicles or people near the farmhouse. I said no. Then he asked if I had opened the exterior telephone box on the house. I hadn't. He seemed relieved. Lewis asked whether I'd touched the wire with bare hands. I said no. Good. I asked why that mattered. He didn't answer. The meeting ended after maybe 15 minutes. Crane thanked me. Before leaving, he said the Danner property issue would be handled by another contractor, and I shouldn't return there unless specifically assigned. Ron agreed. After they left, I asked Ron what Mid-State Infrastructure Review actually did. He said he didn't know. I searched the name online. I found nothing local, no website, no phone listing, nothing in the state contractor database that I could find. For the next week, I stayed away from Danner Lane. The 3 original customers didn't report any more interference. Then one of them called again, an elderly woman named Mrs. Paget. She said her telephone had started ringing at exactly 2:13 every morning. One ring, then nothing. I went to her house during daylight. Her line tested clean. I asked when it had started. She said the night after I'd been working down the road. Then she lowered her voice. Those men came by. I asked what men. 2 fellows in black coats. She said they asked whether she'd heard ringing before or after midnight. They also asked if she could see the Danner farmhouse from her kitchen. She could. I asked if they identified themselves. She said they showed some kind of card, but she didn't read it. Then she said one of them asked whether the upstairs windows at Danner Farm had been lit during the previous week. That bothered me because I had seen Lewis standing in one of those windows. Mrs. Paget said she hadn't noticed any lights. I finished checking her line and left. On the way back to town, I drove past the entrance to Danner Lane. I didn't turn in. The black sedan was parked at the far end. I could see it from the county road. Beside it stood 2 men. They were facing the farmhouse. I kept driving. 2 days later, the company reassigned the entire branch cable to another crew. Ron told me it came from regional management. I asked why. He said there was an issue involving unlicensed signal equipment. That was the first explanation anybody had given that made sense. Illegal radio or telecom equipment could put strange voltage on lines. It could create interference. It didn't explain the missing work ticket, but I was willing to let that part go. About a month passed. Then Mark Hensley called me. He said he'd been sent to Danner Farm to remove an old aerial cable. I told him I'd been specifically told not to go there. He laughed and said apparently nobody had told scheduling. I asked what he'd found. There was no aerial drop, nothing from the pole to the house. I asked if there were people there. No. No sedan either. The farmhouse looked vacant. Mark checked the side of the building. The old telephone protector was still mounted near the foundation. He opened it. There was no customer wire connected inside, just 2 cut copper leads. I asked if he'd gone into the house. He said no. Then he said something odd. While he was standing near the foundation, he heard a telephone ringing inside. I didn't say anything. Mark laughed nervously. He said, "Guess somebody's got a cell phone with an old ringtone." I said maybe. He finished the job and left. That spring, the Danner property finally sold. A family moved in and had new telephone service installed. Fiber, not copper. I wasn't assigned to it. I asked one of the installers if he noticed anything strange. He said, no. The house had been mostly empty inside. No old telephones, no communications equipment, nothing unusual in the basement. By summer, I stopped thinking about it much. Then one evening in August, I was driving home after a late shift. It was hot and humid, with heat lightning flashing in the distance. As I passed County Road 700 East, a black sedan pulled out behind me. It stayed there for about 2 miles. At the next crossroads, it turned away. I got home around 9. My wife, Karen, was sitting on the porch. She said somebody had called the house about 20 minutes earlier asking for me. I asked who. She said the man wouldn't give a name. What did he want? She looked confused. He asked whether you still carried the same test phone in your truck. I went inside and called my supervisor. Ron said nobody from work had tried to reach me. I locked the doors and checked the driveway. Nothing was outside. The next morning, I opened my company truck before leaving for work. My test set was sitting on the passenger seat. I always kept it clipped inside the tool bag behind the driver's seat. I picked it up. The cord had been neatly wrapped around the handle. There was a piece of white tape stuck to the back. Someone had written one number on it in black ink. 43. I peeled the tape off, put it in my pocket, drove to the office, and turned the test set in for replacement before starting my route. The first call came in at 9:18 on a Thursday night from a woman who said there were lights moving over the houses behind her property. I was a patrol officer in western Pennsylvania at the time, working for a small township department outside Butler. My name was Eric Malloy. I was 37, married, 2 kids, and I'd been on the job for a little over 11 years. The township wasn't completely rural, but once you got north of Route 422, the houses spread out fast. You had old farms, wooded lots, gravel drives, and little clusters of homes built along roads that had probably started as wagon paths. That night was unusually warm for October. A storm had passed through earlier, and the roads were still wet. There was mist over some of the fields, but the clouds had broken enough that you could see patches of stars. Dispatch sent me to Hartwell Road. The caller, Denise Carver, lived in a brick ranch house near the end of a dead-end lane. When I pulled up, she was standing in her driveway in slippers and a raincoat. Her husband was beside her. Both were looking north. I got out and asked what they'd seen. Denise pointed over the tree line behind the neighboring houses. 3 of them, she said. I asked 3 what? Lights. Her husband, Gerald, said they had been moving back and forth for about 10 minutes. I looked where they were pointing. At first, I didn't see anything. Then one appeared. It was white, not especially bright. It moved slowly from right to left above the trees. I assumed helicopter. There was no blinking red light that I could see, but the angle and mist could have hidden it. Then a second light appeared farther right. It moved in the opposite direction. That was enough to make me stop talking. I watched both. They weren't fast, they weren't darting around, they just moved slowly and steadily, then stopped. One stayed almost directly over a tall pine at the edge of the Carver's property. The other stopped maybe a quarter mile farther east. I listened for aircraft noise. Nothing obvious. There was traffic in the distance and water dripping from the trees. Gerald said, "That's what we've been saying." I told them it could still be aircraft farther away than they looked. I radioed dispatch and asked if anyone else had called. The dispatcher, Megan Lowe, said they'd received 4 reports in the last 15 minutes, all from the same general area. One caller described 2 lights, another described 5. I asked if county had any helicopters up. She said she'd check. While I waited, a 3rd light appeared. It was lower than the others. It had a faint yellow color. It moved horizontally behind some bare branches and then stopped. I took out my notebook and wrote down the time. 9:27. I asked the Carvers when they first noticed them. Denise said around 9:10. Gerald said closer to 9. They disagreed for a minute. Then, a neighbor walked over. His name was Warren Bell. He said he'd seen one of the lights come straight down through the clouds and stop above the tree line. I asked if he'd seen an aircraft shape. No. Sound? No. Flashing? No. I told everyone to stay in their yards while I drove around to get a better angle. There was a narrow road behind Hartwell that ran past several fields. I headed there. The first half mile was wooded. When I reached an opening, I saw the lights again. There were 4 now. 3 white, 1 yellow. They were spaced unevenly across the sky. None blinked. I stopped the cruiser on the shoulder and turned off the engine. That was when I heard the sound, a low hum, very faint. At first, I thought it came from a transformer on a nearby pole. I got out. The hum seemed to come and go depending on where I stood. I walked 10 or 15 feet from the car. It got louder. I took another few steps toward the field. It disappeared. I backed up. There it was again. That probably had a normal explanation, but it bothered me. Megan came over the radio and said neither county nor state police had aircraft operating in the area. She said she'd contacted the nearby airport too. No known traffic that matched the reports. I asked her to note that. She said she already had. One of the white lights started moving, slowly downward. It went behind the trees. The yellow light followed a few seconds later. The other 2 remained where they were. I called another unit. Officer Tom Rigsby was finishing a traffic stop about 8 miles away. He said he'd head over. Then my portable radio made 3 sharp clicks. No voice, just clicks. I keyed the mic and asked Megan if she'd transmitted something. She said no. The clicks happened again. Then the radio went quiet. I returned to the cruiser. The dash radio worked normally. I drove another half mile and stopped at a house where several people were outside. The homeowner was an older man named Frank Devlin. He told me one of the lights had been directly above his barn. I asked how high. He said he couldn't tell. Low enough, I thought it was a helicopter. I asked why he no longer thought that. He pointed toward his dogs. Two German shepherds were pressed against the side of the house. Neither was barking. Frank said they'd started whining before he noticed the light. Then they refused to leave the porch. I looked at the sky. Only one light remained. It moved north, slow, steady. Then it dimmed until I couldn't see it. No dramatic departure. It just got weaker and disappeared. I wrote down 9:41. Tom arrived around 5 minutes later. By then, there wasn't anything left to show him. He talked with Frank while I drove back toward the Carvers. More people were outside now. Someone had called relatives. A couple of teenagers were filming the sky with their phones. I started taking names and statements. That was normal procedure. I didn't write UFO. I wrote unidentified aerial lights. I had 6 witnesses by 10:05. Their accounts weren't identical, but the basic details matched.